This is Noisy Reality, the Military History Edition. And here's Michael Jankowitz.
Thank you, Ken. Today we're going to be talking about Dieppe, the 1942, what was called reconnaissance in force on the coast of France. And it will be presented. It's a very unique and I think a very exciting idea that David has is going to be presenting. I'm going to tell you something about David O'Keefe. He's a Canadian historian, television presenter, and writer. He's known for presenting War Junk alongside Gemini-nominated and Emmy Award-winning producer and director Wayne Abbott. He has appeared on television and radio networks, including CBC Radio, Global Television, CTV Television Network, UK TV Network, and History TV Channel. For you not so knowledgeable Americans, History TV is the, in my opinion, better Canadian version of the United States channel. O'Keefe served as an infantry officer in the Royal Highland Regiment, Black Watch of Canada in Montreal, and was later employed as their historian for nearly a decade. In addition, he worked as a signals intelligence specialist for the Department of National Defense and conducted research for the official history of the Royal Canadian Navy in the Second World War. O'Keefe has researched in Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. O'Keefe's publications include articles in Canadian Defense Quarterly, the Journal of Canadian Military History, and the Canadian Army Journal, including a chapter in Great War Commands, Historical Perspective on Canadian Army Leadership, 1914 to 1918. Recently, O'Keefe was signed by Knopf, Random House, Canada publishers to write his first full-length monograph on the Dieppe Raid. His research on the Dieppe Raid began almost 2 decades ago and has continued throughout his graduate work and his career as an academic and documentarian. In addition to his academic pursuits, O'Keefe has served as an historian for History Television in Canada for 15 years and appeared on CBC Radio, Global Television, CTV Television Network, UK TV Network, and Great Britain. During his time with History Television, he has worked on numerous television documentaries and publications, including the Camp X, 1999, Murder in Normandy, The Trial of Kurt Meyer, and also in 1999, Enforced March to Freedom, 2001, for David Pepperny Productions. In 2002, he collaborated with Wayne Abbott for the Gemini-nominated 4-part series From a Place Called War. They continued collaborating for over a decade, producing Black Watch, Massacre on Berrier's Ridge for History Television, the 2-part History Television program Bloody Normandy and Bloody Victory, the Secret War Files for History Television, Battle of the Mace, and most recently Dieppe Uncovered and the television series War Junk, both for History Television. He is currently in discussions for a TV series based on his research into Ultra and its impact on the history of the Second World War. With that introduction, I am now going to turn it over to David, who will start the operation.
Thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and joining me today. So good afternoon for those on the Eastern Seaboard, and good morning for you out west, and good evening for those of you who may be joining us from Europe. Today, of course, we're going to be talking about the Dieppe operation. This is the 80th anniversary. So what I'm going to do is just quickly give you a little bit of an impact background, look at the historiography very briefly, get into the new evidence, and I'm going to try to keep it as quick as possible and take as many questions at the end, because needless to say, this will be quite an afternoon for sure. What I will do, if I can, is try to stop and take questions at various increments as we go. Maybe perhaps we can keep those particular questions to the issues that we've already discussed, and then we can get to the other ones moving forward. It's better than stacking them all to the end and then going crazy all over the place. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. Can I get a thumbs up from somebody? Let me know that that is working. You can see it. Thank you, Alex. Appreciate that. As was mentioned in that very kind introduction, the book that is out, it's available right across North America, and particularly in the US and the UK right now, is what you see here, One Day in August. Now, this is the second edition of this book that I put out. The first one that I put out came out in 2013, and that prompted a series of declassifications. And so as such, then over the last, almost 10 years, I ended up cobbling that new information together and then reissuing this. So there's a significant case hardening based on some new material that came out, based on some extra points that perhaps I felt I needed to make a tad stronger, if you will, when it came out in the first edition in Canada back in 2013. So this is the international edition, and this would be, I would argue, the one that is the go-to. So if you're interested in finding out about the intent of the Dieppe operation. Now, remember, there's some other really good works out there if you're interested in Dieppe, which are much more along the narrative vein, which will tell you exactly what happened at what particular time and will be a bit more commemorative. This is an investigation into the intent behind the Dieppe operation, which of course was, or has remained, and at least as far as I'm concerned, had remained a mystery up until the new information came out. Now, just to take you back, one of the reasons why this is so significant, particularly if you are a Canadian, is because essentially this was one of Canada's darkest moments in the Second World War. It was the darkest moment for Canada in the Second World War, but from an international perspective, it also remained one of the greatest mysteries. So for instance, for Canadians, and this was by all means not simply a Canadian show, this was, as I've argued in the book, a British operation with massive Canadian participation and a sprinkling of Allied cooperation as well. And when I say a sprinkling, we have the Poles, we have the Czechs, the Americans, of course, and that's another issue we will talk about because it's fascinating why the Americans were there in the first place, more than necessarily what we've thought until now. And of course, the British and the Canadians. The vast majority of the units or the men involved were Canadian soldiers from the 2nd Canadian Division, as well as British Army Commandos, Royal Marine Commandos, a sprinkling of American Rangers, a few Free French ships, some Polish ships, and then, of course, in the sky, about 800 aircraft that were made up of whatever the RAF could cobble together in 1942. But on that particular day, that one day in August 19th, 1942, there were over 1,000 killed on Dieppe's beaches in just a few hours. That rivals Omaha Beach, if not surpasses it within the time scale. So that gives you the kind of idea in a larger perspective of what we are dealing with in this. Was it planned that way? No, it was not. This was something that turned out to be absolutely horrific. And as you can see, 916 of the 1,000 that died were Canadian. So as a result, this has very much become a Canadian albatross in many ways. And anything and everything that Canadian historians, particularly military historians, have had to deal with for many, many years has always been defined by Dieppe. So for instance, when I was writing about Normandy, it was always, the Black Watch was wiped out on Verrières Ridge on July 25th, which next to Dieppe was the deadliest day for the Canadian Army in the Second World War. So as a result, as a Canadian military historian, you really can never escape Dieppe. And of course, I had absolutely no intention of ever studying this, ever, until I ended up making a discovery, which you will see in a couple of seconds. Now, what I want to do is present these here. Please keep these in mind as we go along. This is kind of the checklist. And what I do throughout the book, and particularly in the last chapter, is I basically tick all the boxes. In other words, what still holds up, what needs to be removed from the argument or the historiographical argument, or, as I mentioned, what needs to be properly recalibrated. And so that's really what we're looking at today. So these are a lot of the excuses that were given, which I'm sure are going to fuel our conversation as we go on today. So the first one, and a lot of these you probably know, was a test. In other words, the idea was it was laid on simply to test Hitler's Atlantic Wall. It was, of course, a reconnaissance in force, as Churchill called it. And the idea was to test the ability, perhaps, to capture a port so they could eventually use it later on. Of course, Mountbatten, who you see in the middle, was the one who claimed that this really, for instance, the success on the beaches of Normandy 2 years later were paid for by the sacrifices at Dieppe in 1942. Now, you can tell probably by my tone how much weight I put into that, but we will have a better and more in-depth conversation as we go. The other one is, lessons learned. In other words, the idea of practicing techniques, amphibious techniques, etc. Another one, which was promoted by the Germans for obvious reasons, was a failed second front. In other words, an attempt to open up a second front. Then, of course, you have the more sacrificial ones, and I have to give great kudos to Gary for an incredible presentation, and also for the legacy of work that you have done and the time you have taken to do it, because I certainly understand that, as you will see in a couple of seconds. When I was watching you do what you were doing on Sledgehammer, I was wondering, I thought, yeah, I can understand this. It feels like we're cut from the same cloth on this one. So I have to, give you praise for what you're doing on that one. I appreciate it without a doubt. So we have the sacrificial excuses. In other words, draw off either air or land units from the Eastern Front to help the Soviets. There's other lines that have been pushed, like PR raid. In other words, because of the success of Saint Nazaire, oh my God, this is exactly the kind of shot in the arm that the British need in the summer of 1942. And maybe, of course, to build up Mountbatten and combined operations. There was also other ones that have suggested that this is part of a deception operation. Some people like, Brian Villa, who I used to study under, Brian believed at first that this was done in an unauthorized action. I would argue that Brian, of course, was a victim of the time, in the sense that he didn't have the kind of access to material that historians of today do. And so as a result, his interpretation back in the late 80s, early 90s was as cutting edge as could be at that time. Eventually, he ended up recalibrating that himself. And he said, well, no, it wasn't so much an unauthorized as an unorthodox action. And as a result, he started looking into it in the sense of setting up a double cross agent. In other words, the Dieppe was thrown on basically to set up the credibility of various agents that they would use later, that they would be able to employ later on for deception operations. And then, of course, there were some other ones that suggested that maybe this was designed to fail right from the start. Basically, we have a little blood for one day and it'll save a massive bloodbath later on, because in 1942, we're just not ready for this. We're not ready to be pushed, as if you're the British, by the Soviets or by the Americans. And then, of course, there's one that came up recently, which just simply suggests, and it's based only on one throwaway line from one of the men who was planning this, the Naval Force Commander, who basically said, well, you have to understand, in 1942, we were just raiding for the sake of raiding. So now those are the rational ones. There are a few others. When I was in Dieppe a few years ago, I heard that this was an anniversary present from Churchill to his wife, because the wife, of course, used to live in Dieppe and apparently had a bad time and decided a little bit of punishment on her birthday would be a good thing to do, or their anniversary. So you can see that, we go for the rational right up to the, completely insane. And we're going to get a bit of that this summer with the 80th anniversary. Now, to get back to what I mentioned before, this was the discovery. And of course, all great or all research journeys begin usually with one discovery. What you see in front of you now was still classified, and you can see the ultra secret classification post-war called Top Secret Cream. So even into the post-war, this was considered to be sensitive, and this was only declassed in 1995 upon the 50th anniversary. And when I was over researching for the official naval history, I took some time at the end of each day to do my own research. And I was fascinated by anything to do, obviously, with signals intelligence and code breaking and whatever else. So when this was declassified, and this is a potted history, a very quick little 3 or 4 page report about the history of signals intelligence operations that were undertaken by 30th Commando, 30th Assault Unit. It's known as the Intelligence Assault Unit, etc. I found this fascinating because, of course, this was the first thing. And if you take a look, and if you go down right here to the 4th paragraph, this was the first time that we have ever seen anything like this connected to the Dieppe operation. As regards captures, the party concerned at Dieppe did not reach their objective. Now, in 1995, this was the first time that any evidence had ever surfaced about a commando unit which was specifically raised to pinch material for code breakers at Bletchley Park being connected to the deadliest day in Canadian military history and, of course, one of the biggest mysteries of the Second World War. Now, obviously, that was kind of interesting, to say the least. Didn't know they were there. This is fascinating. Need a little bit more of more explanation and more investigation. The other thing that caught my attention was down here. B, no raid should be laid on for SIGINT purposes only. SIGINT, signals intelligence, of course. The scope of the objective should always be sufficiently wide to presuppose normal operational objects. So, of course, at first I thought, this sounds crazy. In other words, would they actually mount an operation and make it large enough to be able to get what they're after under the cover of what seems to be a normal raiding operation? I said, well, initially that's what it seems to be, but this needs to be tested. So there's the question, there's the hypothesis, and now, of course, the journey to test the hypothesis began. And when I say it was a journey, there's the journey. 27 years and counting, of course, 175,000 pages, primary source material from right across 3 different archive or countries filled with archives. And I forgot it, Germany as well. And I have about 300 gigabytes digitized. So Gary, when I know, your pain, you understand when I say that, okay? In other words, that's the kind of legacy that goes into it. And I'm sure you probably have something similar for Sledgehammer. But you can see here, almost all of them are from what I like still call the PRO, the British National Archives. Most of them are classes there, but you could see Naval Historical Branch, the Royal Marines, United States Marine Corps too, which is a fascinating story in of itself. A lot of people don't understand the connection between the United States Marines and not only Dieppe, but the Pinch operation. Everything from the FDR Library, Churchill College, and of course the Maritime Museum. And I would argue not only the signals intelligence files that were released en masse around 1995 by GCHQ and the ongoing protracted release, that and of course the NSA and RG457 and NARA, but also the Maritime Museum and a few other facilities who have released the Admiral John Godfrey papers, the Director of Naval Intelligence. These were instrumental in understanding the culture of not only naval intelligence, but naval culture and where it fits within the broader framework of decision-making in politics in Great Britain in 1942. Fascinating stuff, to say the least. So you can see that that's where it starts. That's sort of, if you will, the journey and the methodology. Now, contextually speaking, I think one of the big problems with the Dieppe operation is we've always looked at it strictly from the land or the air component. And one thing that I noticed when I was going through, and of course my methodology was to literally, because of the controversy surrounding it, is strip everything down. One of the big problems with the narrative of Dieppe has been the ex post facto, or the reliance on ex post facto evidence to spin the narrative, challenge the narrative, etc. So my idea was to go back to the original planning documents, rebuild the beast, and just see which way the evidence will take us. And the fascinating part, and of course today I don't have as much time as I would like to. Of course, on World War II TV, I think I did about 7 hours on this. But, the idea is to give you a bit of a, Cole's notes, a Cliff's notes, a very quick interpretation so we can open it up to discussion. So basically what we have completely overlooked is the vital Battle of the Atlantic. And we've never really looked at Dieppe from the naval perspective. And you have to understand that when it comes to combined operations, the Navy is the straw that stirs the drink. Even though Mountbatten can play dress up and put on any uniform he wants, and technically combined operations is his baby. It is completely reliant on naval cooperation. In other words, the Navy essentially holds a de facto veto power over any combined operation. In other words, we don't like it, you don't get the ships. And that was something that was consistent. And so as a result, it wasn't too bad with Mountbatten because, of course, he came from a naval lineage. His dad was director of naval intelligence. And of course, he was involved with signals and signals intelligence at one particular point earlier in the war. But the key is that the Navy is, what, like I said, the straw that stirs the drink. And you don't get a combined operations off the ground unless the Navy sees that there is an imperative for its inclusion in this. They're not just there to be good team players or to go out and obey what the Prime Minister or the Minister of National Defense, one and the same, Winston Churchill, has to say. They are worried about allocation of resources. And that's really the key in 1942, 41 and 42, is the strained resources that the British are operating under, or with, I should say. So anytime any operation goes down, that is the big deciding factor. Who gets what and how much of this? And that usually gives you a good indication of the importance of something as we go along. So just to give you a bit of a background, in 1941, we see the U-boat war, which is flaring up. And of course, Great Britain is hanging on essentially alone. Russia comes in the summer of 1941, but of course that just puts a bit more stress on the British, who are in one case, in one sense, in the sense of supplying the Russians. The big thing with the Russians and the British and the Western allies was the gesture that the Russians wanted, both for practical and political purposes, were supply convoys as opposed to the Second Front. The Second Front would have been the icing on the cake for sure, but even Stalin was rational enough to know that that just wasn't in the cards in 1942, believe it or not. But one thing that he clung to right from the start were the convoys. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth, but basically it had to do with bringing the infrastructure to retool Soviet industry, which had now either been destroyed or was being moved or was victim of scorched earth. And it was, had to be set up again. So that was something in this period. So for Great Britain, they're also hanging on. The sea lanes mean everything. If the sea lanes go down, then of course the war is essentially over. And as Roosevelt would say when the Americans came into the war, the Battle of the Atlantic is essentially the battle of distribution. When the Americans come in, of course, Churchill is doing cartwheels. This is great. We're going to win the war if we can get through 1942. Because of course, it's kind of like a business. It's all about cash flow. And in this case, the United States of America, although they have the juggernaut of an economy, industrial might that is unprecedented, oil resources, manpower, etc., it doesn't mean squat if you can't move it across the oceans to where you need it. And of course, in 1940, 41, and into 42, there is a distinct threat from the U-boats. Although when we look back later, we would see that they probably didn't really have a hope in hell of snuffing off trade. That was not the perception in 1940, 41, and 42. And that's the key as a historian. And this is one thing that I learned very early in my career, was kind of like an intelligence officer. And this is, I think I mentioned this in one of our meetings before, the intelligence officer, the Canadian intelligence officer who was at Dieppe, Peter Wright, who later went on to be the first Canadian Army Chief of Intelligence, basically said the primary job of an intelligence officer is to assess what the enemy is doing, and only secondary what he should be doing. In other words, follow the evidence. So as a historian, I've always taken that to heart. And certainly that has fueled or created the framework for my analysis moving forward in this. So despite the fact that something may look bizarre at first, it does require further investigation then to see if it is indeed bizarre, or perhaps we just looked at it from a different perspective and didn't understand it. So The Battle of the Atlantic, of course, becomes extremely important for this. And the perception was that the possibility of losing the Battle of the Atlantic, maybe not necessarily having the lines permanently severed, but more along the lines of the U-boats forming a boot on a hose that was going to cut off the supplies just long enough to then turn public opinion and force perhaps a negotiated settlement, was something that was really percolating within the British hierarchy, without a doubt. And this is something that was really concerned to Churchill, not only for practical reasons, but also for political reasons. His political detractors were constantly going after him about the U-boats, about the threat of the U-boats, the tonnage that was being sunk, the drop in supplies, the fact that they had to dig into their stocks. These were all things that were being used against him politically. So there was a lot of pressure on by the time we get there. Now, what throws this over the top is that in 1941, one of the ways that the British were able to swing the Battle of the Atlantic back into their favor temporarily was through code breaking. They were able to, through a series, as we will see later on, pinch operations, they were able to break in to the three-rotor Naval Enigma. Okay, anything that was enciphered on the three-rotor Naval Enigma, which included the entire Kriegsmarine, including their U-boats, their surface vessels, small and large, and the home waters and the Atlantic. So anywhere they were operating by the summer of 1941, the British were able to keep their finger on the pulse. As a result, they were able to bring in passive means to combat it. In other words, redirecting your convoys away from wolf packs. Very simple thing to do, but highly effective. And so as a result, the sinkings, which were up at around 600,000 tons a month when they could only take about 300,000 normally, now dropped to under that. So somewhere between 150 and 200,000 tons for the second half of 1941, which was absolutely fantastic for the Allies. But the Germans started to realize that something was up, and they suspected that there was a degree of penetration into some of their three-rotor ciphers. What we didn't realize until just a few years ago was that they had already created a four-rotor version of the Naval Enigma, and they were slowly, through 1941 and into 1942, distributing the new machine to all vessels, starting with submarines in the Atlantic. Now, it's kind of like the phones we use today. Most of us are on 5G, but our phones also work on 3G until everybody gets up to a 5G, then 3G will no longer exist. That was kind of what they were doing with the three and the four rotor. The four rotor could be set to three rotor settings to be able to communicate. So as a result, that was introduced, the four rotor, to the U-boat fleet on February 1st, 1942, when just after the Americans came into the war. So you have instantly there was a blackout at Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park could no longer provide the kind of intelligence they were providing to the Americans before the Americans were in the war. And then, of course, as soon as they started in December, suddenly, or December and January, suddenly in February, everything went dry. And of course, as you know, the Americans kind of stumbled into the war on the East Coast, if you will, not necessarily prepared to adopt convoy tactics, perhaps relying a bit too heavily on the intelligence that was being sent by the British. And then, of course, suddenly there are sinkings like crazy. And we're talking about sinkings that went from 150,000 tons a month to somewhere around 700,000, which is crazy. And half of them were American vessels. More importantly, most of them were tankers, or a lot of them, a high proportion were tankers. And that was the big concern. Not so much the overall tonnage, but rather the fact that the specialized tankers were being sunk. It wasn't so much the oil, that was tough to lose, but the fact that their highly trained crews and the specialized vessels were being sunk. And these could not easily be spit out by either American or British industry. I mean, we hear a lot about Liberty ships being popped out, but they're just cargo ships. They're not special ships. So as a result, now we definitely have a crisis. And of course, when you have a crisis at sea, it's like having an infection in your circulatory system. That's exactly what this is. And so now we have a virus, we have a cancer, however you want to put it, It is now in there, and it underpins everything. You cannot successfully move from one place to another if you're worried about running into U-boats. Doesn't mean that your entire convoy is going to be slaughtered by U-boats, but it means that, of course, you may lose vital shipping and vital cargo, particularly, which I argue is one of the most important next to oil at this time, manpower. Remember that the Americans are moving troop ships like crazy across the Atlantic, and they're planning this for buildup. Last thing you want is a troop ship with 5,000 men to run into a U-boat. To inflict that kind of damage on land would take months, which at sea could be done in a couple of hours with a couple of well-placed torpedoes. So you can understand the difference right there between the possible impact of naval warfare and submarine warfare as opposed to combat on land. So these were the things that were in the back of their mind. Now, I'm just going to quickly go through that. That was the shipping losses. As I mentioned, one of the ways, of course, that naval intelligence and the British Admiralty were hedging their bets when it came to the war was, of course, through SIGINT. All right. So the idea was using it as a force enhancer. They are stretched. The Royal Navy is completely stretched in 1940, 41, and 42. They never expected France to lose to the Germans. They expected a nice tight naval blockade, just like World War I. Now suddenly German units are all the way from the Arctic in Norway, all the way down to the west coast of France. You also have the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean, and then December 1941, the Japanese Navy. So if you're the British, you now have responsibilities for almost the entire globe. And so as a result, you just don't have either the manpower, the resources, or the industrial capacity to keep up with that demand. What you need is essentially insider trading to make sure you understand how to manipulate your stocks, if you will. And that's what SIGINT and cryptography give you. Again, I've used this analogy before, like playing in a poker game where you can read either all or some of your opponent's cards. Doesn't mean you're going to win every hand because you don't control what is dealt, but at least you will understand when to fold them. All right, or when to go all in or somewhere in between. And that's essentially what it gives you. Now, in cryptography, I'd mentioned the 3 and 4 rotor enigmas. The 3 rotor, or at least the odds of breaking a 3 rotor, were 150 million to 1. That would be, in American terms, winning Powerball every single week for 150 straight years. Okay, good luck. The 4 rotor version took that up another notch to 92 septillion to 1. Those were the odds of breaking it without some sort of captured material to speed up the process. A lot of times we look at people like Alan Turing and Dilly Knox and Twin and Alexander and think, oh my God, these people are geniuses. And without a doubt, they are. But even genius needs a cheat to be able to tap into genius. And I think that was one of the big things when I reached out during my research to GCHQ, and we were discussing this with the historian over there, Tony Comer. And he just said, look, he said, you have to understand, this is a world at war. We don't have time for genius to kick in. We have to speed genius up. And so what the British were doing, of course, at that time, were looking for anything and everything to cheat the system, to be able to speed up the process, to get the first big break into an Enigma enciphered or encryption system, and then, of course, allow the geniuses in, like Turing and Twin and all of them, to be able to exploit once they see the lay of the land. So what we didn't realize, and I'm going to just kind of speed this up, until 2014. As a matter of fact, when I approached GCHQ, I had an inkling what Dieppe was about, but I was worried that what I was looking at, this commando unit, was nothing more than a caboose on a train. And it was only when I approached GCHQ and I laid it all out in a 5-page email, and I look back on it now, and it was, I suppose, rather naive. I just figured, oh, well, it's a Hail Mary. I'll send them. This is what I know. This is what, I suspect. Here's the direct evidence, the indirect evidence, etc. Look, I'm coming out with this. So you can refute, you can support, you can deny, you can do whatever. Within 24 hours, they got back to me and basically said, yeah, well, we were eventually planning to release this, but since you're coming out with it, there's some files you need to see. And basically what they released to me provisionally at first, and then they released it in 2014, was the fact that there was a Pinch Doctrine in place to provide those cheats for Bletchley Park. In other words, none of this, at least we thought at one point through David Kahn's amazing work, a lot of these were ad hoc in nature, that they were just benefits of other operations, that basically it was just all about luck. That wasn't the case at all. As a matter of fact, there was an actual policy, which the British eventually were trying to sell to the Americans at Dieppe and later on, where you would have something like a pinch by chance. Now, a pinch by chance is probably what we have thought most of these operations were. In other words, during the course of a normal operation, you happen to stumble across something that looks like a typewriter, an Enigma machine, its associated code books and cipher tables, wheels, whatever else. Fantastic. Pick it up. Bring it back. What a chance capture that was. Well, they also had pinch by opportunity. In other words, hey, we hear that you're going to Port X. Port X happens to have a naval facility, a supply depot, and cryptographic material. Be prepared to capture it. The other one was fascinating. Pinch by design. In other words, we have a problem, lay on an operation, dress it up to disguise it as a normal one, but go get what we're looking for. So right there, that's when this material was released to me, I now realized I had the glue, and I also had the confidence now to come forward and shoot my mouth off and say that this is what Dieppe was all about. And one of the reasons why I say that, and you'll see the evidence as we go along, was because, of course, it supports what we had seen so far. So basically, you are using what is called, or what Godfrey called, Admiral John Godfrey, a steam hammer to crack a nut, using disproportionate amount of force to give the appearance of a conventional operation, when in reality, at the core of it, it is a special operation. And I would argue this is perhaps the origins of modern special operations. So in other words, commando operations were not just all about going in, destroying things, mucking about, and leaving. And as you will see with Dieppe, not only do we have an infiltration, but we also have an exfiltration plan as well. So the idea was to go in and use disproportionate amount of forces. And as I mentioned on other shows, for pinch operations that they were conducting at sea. So for instance, there was a lone weather trawler that was out at sea for months, and it had a stockpile of material, which looked really good and exactly what the cryptographers would want back at Bletchley. The British Navy laid on a force of 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers to go after a lowly trawler out in the middle of sea. Why? Not because they needed that kind of force to do it, but because it would never look like it was anything but incidental to the Germans. In other words, that this cruiser force was just passing by and boom, it hit it, and that's why it's, the trawler was destroyed. So in other words, they wanted to throw the Germans off the scent, that they were targeting specifically this kind of information. If it happened to fall into hands incidentally, that was fine, because you couldn't stop the Germans from being suspicious. What you didn't want to do is tune the Germans into the fact that you had a factory like Bletchley Park in existence that had figured out a way to systematically not only break into German encrypted material, but exploit it as well. So there are various degrees of this. And from what we can see with the Germans understood the possibility of the Enigma being broken, but for a couple of different reasons. First of all, they didn't have the reception at the upper end like they did with Churchill and the Americans when it came to the concept of cryptography. Hitler wasn't really interested in it, and neither were the Nazis. In other words, yeah, it's fine. We get a couple of kernels from it, but don't worry about it. The other problem too was pride. There was not enough signal security within the German Navy, Army, or Air Force to the point where they would ever admit that they perhaps had been penetrated, because nobody wanted to carry the can for dropping the ball on cryptographic security. Nobody wanted to end up on the Eastern Front or worse. So as a result, there was a lot of convenient head burying in the sand going on with the Germans. And this all fell into, or at least aided, the Allies. But the idea was you could push the envelope if you were the Allies, but you couldn't push it too far. And that became the real art and the craft of pulling off pinch operations. So for instance, you can see on the right, you can see how the pinch operations were then portrayed in the press. The idea was that the Nazi ships were not captured, but sunk. And that was the idea. In other words, the idea was if you captured anything, make sure that in the press report, there were glowing accounts of you destroying this ship, or the ship was sunk before it was boarded. Anything and everything to deflect the fact that your boarding parties were able to get on and grab the material that you were after in the first place. By the way, a little bit of sidebar, what you see in front of you is actually a fascinating photograph. This, without a doubt, was staged, but I found this in the National Archives in College Park in RG 457 on a report on the four-rotor Naval Enigma, believe it or not. In other words, this is a photo that they put in for training purposes. In other words, give you an example of what lengths they would go to pinch the kind of material that they need to speed up the process. I couldn't believe it, because here I am flipping through this, and it's a lot of, mathematical passages about this and then breaking. And then of course there's some, examples of captured material that they photographed and whatever else in the machine. And then this, which was really fascinating to see, without a doubt. So I can let you speculate a little bit about that one. Now, one of the reasons why this research is important, and the discovery and the declassification was important about the Pinch Doctrine, is because now you can superimpose that on the other operations that went in earlier. The first one was one that was created in 1940, just as France had fallen, and it was called Operation Ruthless, and it was in the English Channel, and it was created by Ian Fleming, and we'll get into Ian Fleming after. But it was created by Ian Fleming, and it had full sanction of the Navy and the Air Force. And the idea was to dress up a commando unit like a German bomber crew, put them in a captured German bomber. And then basically, as one of the bombing raids were heading back from London and over the Channel, they were going to fake an emergency. They were going to crash land after drawing out a rescue ship that was carrying the Enigma material they needed. And then basically it was a Trojan horse play. And so when they were rescued, they were going to spring into action. They were going to take the ship, capture the material, kill the crew to get rid of witnesses, and then they were going to take the material back to England. Now, we've heard about this. A lot of people have said, well, this is just Fleming's imagination. This was just a flight of Fleming fancy. Say that. How's that for alliteration? But in reality, it did go in. It went in twice. And that was the fascinating part when I was doing the research, was actually finding this and the level of cooperation between the Air Force. As a matter of fact, it was Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian who was in the cabinet, Churchill's cabinet, who actually cleared airspace during the Battle of Britain to get this done. That's how important this was, breaking into Naval Enigma, because of course in 1940, they're expecting an invasion anytime soon. So they did this. They did this twice, but they came up empty on both occasions. They just didn't find a target. Well, then they decided that perhaps taking these raids instead of in mid-channel, where you would try to draw out a ship and take it in isolation, maybe what we should do is actually take it ashore. Because one of the things that they've noticed up until this point was the last thing that you needed to close time and space in a pinch operation. It's the clock starts ticking once the enemy knows you're there. So the idea is the longer a ship out at sea or in a body of water, a large body of water, has to run away from you, the more it has to go into its standard, more time it has to go into its standard operating procedure of destroying any vital documents and machines that they have on board, whether it be SIGINT or whatever else. So the idea was that if we raid on shore, we have a couple of positives. One, we corral ships into a port. They can't get away. They're either berthed or they have no room for maneuver. Secondly, or as some people would say, even more importantly, you have a naval headquarters and a naval supply facility with distribution. In other words, or stocked for distribution. In other words, remember with signals material, if you're a ship, you usually only have the cipher aids for the current month and maybe next month. But the headquarters and supply facilities will have them for months on end set for distribution. All right, later on. So we see this with Operation Claymore. As a matter of fact, Operation Claymore is the first pinch buy design when it comes to a raiding operation that we know of. And this was put on and it was highly successful. As a matter of fact, they grabbed material here, which led to the first big break. It was followed up by a pinch by chance later on. And then, of course, there was a series of operations when they discovered, after the capture of U-110 in May of 1941, when they discovered that, from what they found on the U-110, they discovered that a four-rotor Enigma existed and that it had been, distribution had started sometime in January 1941. They decided to put on a series of raids on trawlers and other ancillary vessels that were supporting the Bismarck. And so they went after them in the summer, the late spring and early summer of 1941. And there was about 15 or 16 of these operations. Now, the problem was they were kind of getting drunk on their success. And so as a result, the Germans started cluing in by the end of the summer that something was up, because suddenly all these trawlers were disappearing. And it was all the trawlers disappearing, the ancillary vessels, that suddenly started to form a pattern. It wasn't necessarily conclusive, but it was enough to speed up the introduction of the four-rotor. And as a matter of fact, starting in the fall of 1941, there was conclusive evidence that U-boats were carrying the four-rotor, but had not gone over to the four-rotor as of yet. So again, your brand new iPhone with 5G technology using a 3G, but you know the 5G is coming anytime, you know, around the corner. So as a result, another raid was laid on, and that was the twin operation of Anklet and Archery up in the Lofoten Islands again. It was relatively successful when it came to three-rotor material, but it came up short with four-rotor. Then, of course, the four-rotor crisis comes in February 1st, 1942. And of course, everything is blacked out. The sinkings are going up. The Americans are putting massive pressure on the British. Why? Because they had an agreement, an intelligence sharing agreement that was conducted, that was developed in 1940-41, where the British would control all of the European sector, and they would decrypt anything and everything to do with Enigma, and basically pass everything to the Americans in exchange for what the Americans were doing for the Japanese. So that intelligence sharing agreement was working fine until February 1st. Once the British could no longer produce the goods, and they never told the Americans why, i.e. there was a new Enigma machine, they just kind of stalled and were trying desperately to find the answer. The Americans then started sending rockets through the embassy. We want a captured Enigma now. We want ancillary material. We are going to start working on this because our ships are going down and you're not providing the goods. So starting in March, there is a massive amount of pressure being put on by the Americans, and the British are worried because partly the British are trying to maintain their lead, if not monopolization, of cryptographic technology in what is dawning of the digital age. So they don't necessarily want to yield ground. They want to solve this pretty quickly. Eventually, they have to bring the Americans in on this, and that's why the Americans are at Dieppe, believe it or not. How's that for a big bomb to drop on you? All right. Now, there were other operations that were going on either by design or by opportunity. And of course, one of them would be Operation Chariot, the famous St. Nazaire raid, which a lot of people don't realize actually had a twin. And the twin operation was Myrmidon. And it was supposed to go in on the same day. And that was at Bayonne, further south. So in other words, one raiding party would hit St. Nazaire and hit the U-boat base up there, obviously. If not a pinch by design, certainly a pinch by opportunity. You're hitting a U-boat base. And then, of course, Bayonne, it was very similar to Dieppe. In other words, headquarters, trawlers, supply depot. So as a result, these were the twin operations. It appears that there was a lot of hope being held out that these would score success. Both of them came up empty when it came to pinching material for Bletchley Park. Operation Chariot, although one of the colonel of the commandos, is it Newsom or Newman? I'm pretty sure, ended up in naval headquarters, but couldn't extricate. In other words, he got in, but couldn't get out with whatever material he may have captured. The other one, Myrmidon, was delayed and then literally abandoned when they arrived off the estuary that led into Bayonne. Apparently, somebody didn't do the planning properly, and there was a sandbar that prevented entry on this day because somebody had miscalculated the tides, believe it or not. So basically, the entire raiding force just skulked away in the middle of the night before the Germans could figure out what was going on. But either way, the crisis remained. And this is the origin of the Dieppe operation, because unlike what we have seen some indication, again, ex post facto, that Dieppe may have been planned or at least shown up on the radar around January of 1942. There is no evidence that any type of planning or Dieppe was ever taken seriously until the end of March, early April 1942, following the discovery that the four-rotor had been distributed to ships of the 2nd Defense Division operating between Boulogne and Dieppe. And Dieppe, being the major supply facility for cryptographic and other material, seemed to be the perfect elixir to what they were looking for at this time. That's when the planning for Dieppe goes into overdrive. As a matter of fact, the first concept of Dieppe, as you'll see in a couple of minutes, is laid down by John Godfrey's pet project, the Inter-Services Topographical Department. And Gary, I mentioned that to you. They were the ones that did the vast majority of the planning in 1941, 42, 43, 44, and 45. As a matter of fact, there's millions of pages of stuff that they have done that's in the Public Record Office now. But they started off in late 41, and they were approached by Mountbatten and vice versa. And what you have is Mountbatten and Godfrey working kind of hand in glove on this. Both of them are empire builders, without a doubt. Mountbatten wants combined operations to succeed, and how better to succeed than bringing the Holy Grail back to Churchill, who of course is a massive fanatic when it comes to signals intelligence and anything to do with intelligence. And also Godfrey. Godfrey is trying to sell his wares, pinch operations, and particularly the planning and the intelligence done by the Inter-Services Topographical Department. So basically you see a dovetailing. They're coming together at this particular point. So the basic concept for Dieppe is laid down in a special report that's issued on April 5th, by the Inter-Services Topographical Department. And when you take a look at it, there's the Dieppe operation in outline, without a doubt. It's absolutely amazing. So this is the background. So in other words, we do have historical precedent for these pinch operations. And the other thing too, I mean, if I have a graduate student working for me, I think one of the big, potential gold mines for historical research would be a complete reassessment of combined operations based on the fact that we now know that this doctrine existed. They'd be able to go back, take a look at all the operations that they either put on or proposed, and then, of course, put this to the litmus test to see. Absolutely fascinating. So, if I have a graduate student someday out there, I'll be pushing them towards it. So the elements, which you will all see are prevalent at Dieppe: surprise, shrapnel, and boarding. Surprise, surprise, surprise. This is one of, I would argue, perhaps the Achilles heel of any pinch operation, particularly the way Mountbatten was looking at it. You always want surprise in any operation that you're going to plan. But in this case, the sliders are pushed right across, right to the end, to the point where there's a potential detriment for the balance of the entire operation. But that is something they knew going in, but they were willing to risk it. Again, the idea was a thunderclap of surprise, i.e., with the strained resources you have, you don't need a D-Day type of naval support to be able to blast your way onto shore. What you want and need in these operations is suppressive fire. In other words, it doesn't have to be destructive. Basically, you want to panic, startle, maybe kill the crews, but you don't want to do so much damage to the point where you destroy what you're after to start with. So it's a very delicate balance, without a doubt. There's also an infiltration into the target, exfiltration to get the material out. And then, of course, to cover your tracks, there's a destruction of the entire area, which we see in all these. And the other thing that's fascinating, which comes out of the documents, is that heavy casualties could be incurred, if necessary, for anything that is designated an A1 target. A1 targets, anything to do with Enigma. So as a result, not to say that the Dieppe operation was as bad as it was because these were A1 targets. To be honest with you, I think they went completely overboard and nobody expected to take these kind of casualties on that day. But these are the types of material that fell into the A1 category. So all of these are available at Dieppe. Okay, so they're all on shore. And you can see here on the left, this is part of the planning papers. You can see that they are looking for an inventory. So in other words, the type of vessels. So you have anything from E-boats and R-boats and minesweepers and bargers and trawlers, etc. The first three, E-boats, R-boats, and minesweepers, all are carrying the latest in Enigma. The others could be, depending on the level of distribution by this time. But what the other ones carry are sort of backdoor entry points for the cryptographers. In other words, lower level codes that can be used for cribbing purposes. Okay, so it's kind of like, you know, when we're playing Wordle or doing a crossword, when you get a couple of extra letters, then you know how to reduce the odds. That's exactly what they're looking for. So Dieppe, of course, not only houses ships on a regular basis, being not only a terminus, but a vital waypoint in the mid part of the channel. Again, it also houses a supply depot, which will be stockpiling either the new machine or the ancillary documents, which are vital. And to be honest with you, it's more about getting your hands on the documents than it is the machine per se. So they have the ships, they have the supply facility, and they have a naval headquarters as well. And they've also been tracking Dieppe since 1940. As a matter of fact, Operation Ruthless, which I mentioned earlier, the ships that they were trying to draw out and capture all were coming from Dieppe. So Dieppe has always been linked to pinch operations since 1940. This is a shot actually of the trawlers that call Dieppe home on a regular basis. And in the background, you can see some larger vessels. For those of you who may have been to Dieppe, you'll know that this is the outer port, which is just behind Main Beach. Main Beach, Red Beach, actually, sorry, is just to the left here. And you can see here, this is a still from a German newsreel that was shot on the afternoon of the attack. And of course, by the afternoon, the attack was over and the Germans basically were just getting back to life. So you can see not only the lower level trawlers, which would have some of the ancillary material that they were looking for, but also larger vessels. And there's also some shots somewhere, I'm not sure if I have it in here, of the day itself or during the battle, where you can actually see that these are berthed there. So, you know, obviously you're not planning an operation like this with 100% certainty that you're going to find what you're looking for. but the odds were certainly in your favor if you're the British, that given the fact that you have a fixed headquarters, a fixed supply facility, that you will be able to get what you're looking for, even if for some reason the ships don't happen to be there on a given day. But you can see, this is the aerial view. The first photo that I showed you was taken from down here, the newsreel. So basically this way. The newsreel was shot from this way. And this is Dieppe's main beach right here. This is Red Beach and this is White Beach. This is sadly where the vast majority of the Canadians were killed on that morning. What they were after was what British intelligence suspected were housed in either of these two buildings, which they suspected was naval headquarters. This is Les Arcades Hotel, and during the war, this was Hotel Moderne. British intelligence mixed them up. They thought this one was the Hotel Moderne, and this one was Les Arcades in their targeting. But either way, as you can see, they're about 25 feet apart. So they were pretty much in the ballpark, had they been able to get there. Now, when the planning started, this is one of the earliest maps that we have that I've been able to find so far. This comes from early May. So basically, when the outline plan is laid down in April, there's a lot of discussion about in the outline before any of the detailed planning is done. So basically, it's kind of like having a game plan on a football team before you even know what players you have. Okay, basically, we're going to run a West Coast offense. Okay, now let's go out and get the players that will be able to do that. All right. The key with this is you can see right from the earliest planning, despite the fact that the intelligence workups have been done and they know of all the different headquarters that are in the area, whether it be Army headquarters, Gestapo headquarters, whatever else, there's only one headquarters on this map right from the beginning. And that is right here. And that's the German naval headquarters, the Hotel Moderne, which is right here. So that is quite interesting to see right from the start. And it's not the only thing that was also in from the start. And if we do a quick recap of the planning timeline, January 1942, like I said, even though there was some mention of Dieppe at that time, nothing. March 13, suddenly Dieppe becomes hot and urgent. Without a doubt, the Inter Services Topographical Department, after the discovery that the four-rotor is being distributed to ships that are using Dieppe, boom, Dieppe is on the radar for sure. April 8th, the outline planning begins, which I'll show you very quickly in a second. Again, this is the West Coast offense we're going to use. We don't have our players yet, except we know we have a star running back, so we'll build everything around that. Not that that's necessarily the West Coast offense, but you know what I mean. All right. And then, of course, by April 25th, Mountbatten and the chiefs of staff sign off on the outline plan, not the detailed one. So whatever's in the outline plan has satisfied not only Mountbatten, but also the chiefs of staff. Okay, that's key. Then, of course, on the 27th, that's when the players are brought onto the field. So in other words, the Canadians, who frankly hoisted themselves on this operation. In other words, the Canadians were looking to get in, and as a result, they were pushing. Mountbatten didn't want the Canadians. Mountbatten wanted this to be carried out by the Royal Marine Division, which was on the chopping block, bureaucratically speaking. And Churchill was forced by the Canadians, who were squawking like crazy, and he just basically said, look, the Canadians are on this. So Mountbatten said, fine, but I'm keeping my star running back. And the star running back were the Royal Marine Commandos, who were tasked with pinching the material in Dieppe. And so they were there right from the start. Where this can get a little bit confusing is at this time, because all the other pinch operations, when they were carried out by ad hoc pinch units. A lot of them were ships companies that basically were, put on as boarding parties. And most of these guys had no clue what they were looking for, let alone respect for what they were trying to find. A lot of times they ended up looting more than they did capturing. And it also meant that they had to take experts who were fully indoctrinated into Bletchley, etc., into or onto the enemy vessels with them to find what they were looking for. This was an unacceptable level of risk. So Fleming and Godfrey, Ian Fleming on the right, who was the assistant to John Godfrey, the director of naval intelligence on the left, decided at the end of March, when suddenly they realized they would have to pinch material again, decided to create a specific unit dedicated to this. And that's how we end up with the 30th Assault Unit eventually. The idea was to take one platoon from the Royal Marine Commando that was already designated for pinching at Dieppe and turn that into the fledgling or experimental intelligence assault unit. The idea being that you can indoctrinate them to a certain degree. This is kind of what you're looking for. You're looking for a typewriter, you're looking for this, you're looking for that. You know, a few of you guys speak German. This is absolutely wonderful. You'll need that for interrogation, for documents and things like that. But of course, they were left in the dark completely as to where this was going and what the significance of this was. But they were essentially a self-contained fighting unit. So platoon strength, armed with Tommy guns, rifles, haversacks to collect the material, and fire extinguishers to be able to put out any of the fires that the Germans set to try to destroy the documents that they were working off. So basically, you're getting the origins of truly one of the first specialized special operations units. Almost all of them to this point had been more of that destructive nature. We're going to go in, we're going to blow, something up. We're going to stir up shit. We're going to this, this is the first one that I can see, along with the United States Marine Corps Raiders, where it's all about the infiltration and the exfiltration. In other words, you're getting in, you'll do a little mucking about, but the idea is you're going in and then pulling stuff out as well. So that is something that is really significant at this particular point. Now, to quickly get back, and I have to sort of jump into this. I've mentioned Ian Fleming a couple of times, and you can imagine, how my eyes rolled, when I realized that Ian Fleming was behind the creation of the unit. One of the big problems with Ian Fleming, of course, is, half the world thinks he's Bond and the other half thinks he's some sort of idiot. He was neither. Fleming is a much more interesting, fascinating, important, and intelligent character than we ever imagined. He is not James Bond. He didn't go into the field per se on regular occasion, but what made him very important, and likely one of the reasons why the British government was quite ready to sort of poo-poo his memory, was because this is the portfolio that he carried. And this is something that's also come to light with my research. So in other words, you have him as the head of Section 17 of Naval Intelligence. He's also the personal assistant for the Director of Naval Intelligence. He was recruited in 1939 specifically because he was the ideas man. He was Machiavellian, he was creative, and he lived up to all of that. And that's what John Godfrey was looking for. Godfrey was all about decentralization. Get the best people, let them do what they do really well. Well, Fleming, of course, was not only responsible for creating pinch operations, but he also liaised with MI6, MI5, the Americans, with the FBI, the OSS, and the ONI, political warfare executive in England, inter-services topographical department. He actually was, I don't know if associate member was right, but he was on the Joint Intelligence Committee, or at least he assisted Godfrey, who was on the JIC, the Ministry of Economic Warfare, liaised with Bletchley Park, and of course, MI5. So there's a lot more. Again, if I have another graduate student, oh boy, am I telling him to go in to look at who the real Ian Fleming was circa 1942, because there is a much more to him. He's nowhere near the chocolate sailor that he has been portrayed, but he's not Bond either. But he could definitely be a lightning rod to a whole bunch of other things. As a matter of fact, I think that new movie coming out on Operation Mincemeat, definitely without a doubt has Fleming's fingerprints all over it. And the same thing, of course, with Ruthless and a whole bunch of other bizarre things like Operation Tracer. That is the proposal. You can see Fleming down here at the bottom on the 20th. So 1 week after they discover that Dieppe is housing what they're after, he is proposing the creation of the Special Commando Unit. And originally, he's thinking about it for Operation Sledgehammer, which is interesting, which says that Sledgehammer is probably up there and still steaming ahead even before Dieppe has got the official nod. And of course, that was him on the right. This is the 30th Commando, and of course, I had to throw this in, or what eventually would be 30 Commando. This is X-Platoon from Royal Marine A Commando. And of course, when I look at them, the average age or their ages ran between 18 and 21. Their commanding officer, Huntington Whiteley, was 21 years old. The old man, Krutoffer, which I believe he's one of these two, was all of 24. And so as a result, they're my college class. And that just never ceases to amaze me that these kids were, and literally kids, between 18 and 21 mostly. One of the reasons why Huntington Whiteley was picked, I wasn't sure at first why suddenly he would get the nod, but basically it comes out to the old tradition of nepotism in British intelligence. He could be trusted. His grandfather was the former Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. One of his uncles was Rudyard Kipling, for God's sakes. And I've said this before, if you sawed him in half, you'd bleed the Union Jack. So as a result, he was definitely within the community and could be trusted because, of course, they knew his family and knew them well. Now, maybe I should stop a little bit because I've been going for probably about a half an hour, maybe take a couple of questions before we take a look at the rating force allocations. I don't know if I see anybody's hands. I'm not sure if there are no questions. I'll keep going.
Well, actually, I'll throw in a question just
you.
to start things off. What about other, which I guess, according to what you're saying, would be more ancillary operations, like Jack Nissenthal's attempt to crack the Freya radar system? Do you think that was an add-on?
That was kind of there in the mix at the beginning, but remember that the race for radar was a very close race, and both sides essentially knew what was going on the other side. So there was no need for great security on that. But yes, that certainly would be an opportunistic thing. In other words, as you will see, when it comes to Nissenthal, there were no contingencies built in to his operation. He was just simply following in on the heels. I think it was the South Saskatchewan Regiment. Yeah. And basically, as long as they got to their target, he was able to get in. But as you will see with the Royal Marines, there are multiple contingencies built into this operation, not with Nissenthal or for anything else in the operation as well. Okay.
By contingencies, you mean backup?
Contingencies. What the British would call branches and sequels, what we would consider to be contingencies. In other words, okay, if the first running back didn't get in, what do we do now?
Right.
So basically, or how many downs do we have? What happens if we get stopped on first down? Are we going to run the ball again? Yes. Okay. So you don't have that with any other aspect of the entire operation. And you will see that in a few minutes when we go through it. So with Nissenthal, it was just simply he was following along, and if he happened to reach his target, fantastic. But it was not interwoven into the DNA of the operation.
Okay. David, we're going to stop your share for a second because you got like 4 more questions. I'll do it.
Yeah. Okay. I'll stop that. Hang on a second.
I got it.
Oh, you got it. Wonderful.
And here comes Joyce.
Yes, Joe? David. Yes, David, you can defer my question if it's too early, but I'd like to know if X-Platoon took casualties and, if you find someone running around with a fire extinguisher, wouldn't that make you suspicious?
Oh, yeah, they did take casualties. The way it went down, the plan did not go according to plan. Shocking. And basically they got down, there were 4 contingencies built in, and they basically used all 4. So instead, as you will see, and I guess I suppose I have to defer it. You'll see it in a couple of minutes, and it might answer your question. But basically, they ended up transshipping, and instead of going into the harbor as planned, they were going in over Main Beach. And they ended up taking casualties. Most of them swam out to make sure they did not fall into enemy hands. But yes, without a doubt, that was a big worry, actually, when some of them didn't show up. The British were really worried, particularly when Huntington Whiteley went missing. So, and then he was found very quickly. But that was, it was terrifying. Yeah, you'll see a little bit more how it all comes down coming up, okay? Gary?
Okay, Gary, go ahead, Gary. You have to unmute, Gary.
Unmute, Gary.
Okay.
There you
Sorry.
go.
The prompt actually got in my way. Okay, so many things I'd like to ask you about, but I'm just gonna keep it to one right now. So there's this idea out there that the earlier versions of the Dieppe Raid plan emphasize the flanking landings more than the direct assault on the port. You see it in the literature, and so my question is, first, is that valid at all? Did you see that anywhere in the documents? And is it possible that it changed maybe once the pinch part became the focus of the operation, or is that just a complete myth from what you can see?
Essentially, it's a complete myth. There is no evidence to suggest, well, first of all, that's not the case. In other words, they were not heavier on the flanks at all. You'll understand when I show you how the operation was to go on in a couple of minutes, why the landings were important where they were. There was a little bit of talk at the beginning, even though the pinch was already in. You have an idea of what you want to do, but you will thrash around how you're going to do it for a little bit. And so there was discussions about the tanks, and the tanks become extremely important in all this, as you will see in a few minutes. And there apparently was some discussion, but nothing serious about having them land on the flanks. And they basically, nixed that very quickly. They said, well, no, because they have to cross rivers and the various defiles and choke points could easily be blocked and we'll never get them in on time. So that was something that if it was discussed, it was dismissed very quickly. All right, so that's something, again, that's the problem with Dieppe is the ex post facto rationales and the misconstrued narratives that we've had. And there's, going back and rebuilding the beast, there's no support for that whatsoever. As a matter of fact, there's tons of evidence to show the opposite is true.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Brandon?
Quick follow-up on what Gary said. Another Canadian historian noted that late in the planning, Montgomery was involved, and he was the one who switched the armor over. And I don't know if that had anything to do with that. And that was in the cabinet notes he found of a cabinet discussion. And that might, whether Montgomery knew about Pinch or not, I don't have any clue. Obviously, I don't know if you do. The actual question I was going to ask: are you aware of this operation that took part off the coast of Africa to capture a U-boat in 1943 that actually succeeded? It's here I'm in Chicago. It's in the Museum of Science and Industry. And they have, okay. Yeah, believe it or not. And they captured this thing intact. And they got the 4-rotor Enigma machine with it. And it's all on display here in this museum, which I found to be utterly incredible. Including the question I asked the tour guide, it didn't all fit together until I just heard what you said. And now it all makes a lot more sense. So you might want to look into that. Anyway, that's enough for me.
Well, it's fascinating because I know that, after the Dieppe raid, this seems to be the last big pinch operation. In other words, the pinch by design. Partly that had to do with the fact that through chance, the 4-rotor was cracked temporarily in late part of 1942 into 43, and then permanently in 1943, summer of 43. So there wasn't really a requirement for a big pinch by design, after that. And I know that they actually shut down pinch operations. The British actually reached out. The Canadians were trying one with an escaping prisoner of war. As a matter of fact, he was a U-boat captain that was trying to escape from Canada. They found out about it and they figured, oh, well, we'll just, the U-boat's coming to pick him up. We'll capture the U-boat. And this was in late 43. And basically the British found out about it because, the Canadians were reaching out for advice and they shut it down. They basically said, look, don't worry, we're in. All you're going to do is screw things up. So forget about it. Go after the captain and make sure he doesn't get back. But at the same time, these things are on hold now. We have what we want, and we really will only mount these if we need an initial break. But we're not going to mount them anymore, at least by design, because we're already in. So it's fine later on, for instance, when the 30th Assault Unit goes into Sicily and it goes into Normandy, etc. They're coming in by opportunity. They have their targets, but it's, they're passengers on that one. Whereas at Dieppe, they're very much a locomotive pulling the train. Okay, that was Brandon. Alex?
Yeah. Hey, David, it's been great so far. But the question I have is, I wonder who in Second Canadian Division was told the real reason for Dieppe, and also if you know who in the Canadian government, Canadian military, like how many people did they let know what this was really about? Yeah.
Well, I can't really say that I have the direct evidence to say that here's the message saying that we are pinching and we're going for these purposes. But there's no doubt that right up to the Canadian Chiefs of Staff, they knew of the special nature of this operation. And when you actually do a process of elimination, there really is only one special, special aspect of this that we can discern at this particular point. I mean, look, history is what history is. It's revisionist by nature, and maybe there'll be a massive discovery somewhere along the lines that will change this. But I certainly don't see it. But certainly Ham Roberts knew. Certainly, as you will see, one of the battalion commanders knew. Again, they knew what to look for. They didn't know the significance, but they knew what they were going after, for sure. As a matter of fact, Ham Roberts at one point got a little cocky and basically said, look, what we are after may change the outcome of the war, which is absolutely fascinating. Now, of course, I don't have any direct evidence to suggest that that's exactly what he was talking about. But if you take a look at the context and the way he calls the shots and the plans and everything else, the preponderance of evidence is just overwhelming on that. So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that if you dig a little more, I'm sure you're going to find the answer to that. So the Canadians were clued in to a certain degree. The Canadians did know around this time about Bletchley. They were getting product. The Canadian Navy.
And are you pretty sure Mackenzie King was told?
As far as I can see, yeah, Mackenzie King was an odd duck, to say the least. But he was the prime minister, so to a certain degree, and he certainly knew about the so-called remount, which I have argued really isn't a remount at all. It's just basically a postponement. There was no real cancellation. It was part of Mountbatten and his double bluff theory. And you can see that right from the start. So when Rudder is postponed on July 7th, a message is sent back to the Chiefs of Staff in Canada and to Mackenzie King's government saying that, a special matter will eventually go back in on the 18th of, around the 18th of August, between the 18th and 25th of August. So it was just all a question of waiting for the right title period. And you could not get the next title period that would allow you to do this was the 18th to the 25th of August. So you had to stand down. So that's what you see from there. Jim, did you have a follow-up question, or is your hand just still up from earlier?
No, Jim.
No, I wanted to ask something quickly.
Oh, sorry.
And mind-boggling as I expected, David. I wanted to just quickly get your assessment of, and this is for folks listening down the road. When F.H. Kinsley did his multi-volume intelligence history of the British, how did he maneuver around this? I mean, because you're talking about how this is declassified after his death, actually.
Yep.
So how does he handle these kind of aspects of what you're probing into in that massive work, which we all regard as sort of a seminal breakthrough in understanding all this? The United States never did anything like that in World War II.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, he just says they were there. In other words, 30th Assault Unit was there. He just makes it seem as it was incidental. Now, the fascinating part is, remember that Harry Hinsley, who I absolutely adore, also is in a conflict of interest position. The Pinch Committee that was recommending targets, he was the chair. So as a result, when you're talking about a little bit of blood on your hands for things that go wrong, and I have his, there's a note that he signs the day after. So basically, as soon as Dieppe fails to score, he is looking for targets in the Mediterranean now. So unfortunately, I'm not sure how much of it was declassification. I hate to think that it was a conflict of interest and he was trying to downplay his own responsibility in this. That would be something that would have to be further, investigated further. I met him on a couple of occasions, actually one very fascinating occasion. I did not get a chance to speak directly about Dieppe because, frankly, it was right at the beginning. I think I might have discovered that document a day or two before, but it was one of those things where it seemed so outlandish. You know, I'm not going to talk to Yoda, you know, about this. So as a result, I had to keep my cards close to my chest, but I was there to discuss other things, which actually factor into the book, the contextual idea of intelligence sharing and the monopoly and the British approaches to things like this, which all break in. But if you go back and take a look, there, without a doubt, this definitely needs to be revamped. And in the official history, he just basically says, yeah, they were there. And that was about it. He doesn't dare discuss the concept of a doctrine, the fact that they were out doing this for 18 months before that. So yeah, this is stuff that was still rather sensitive. And part of it is because they're still doing operations like this today. 30th Assault Unit still exists. Pinch operations now, I would argue, have probably become just the norm of special operations, where this is just what you do when you are there. But that is now culturally accepted or culturally part of the norm, whereas it was a developing culture during the Second World War. And everything I've discussed about Pinch Doctrine up to this time should probably be qualified by saying it was developing as they were going. They were still trying to figure out how to do it, how big to do it, you know, what kind of scale, what kind of abilities or resources they had to pull these things off. So, you know, again, he's writing in 1979, right? So Ultra had just been revealed. Most of the material had yet to be declassified. It was only really in 1995 when there was a truckload of material. And then there's still material that's still classified, particularly when it comes to the intellectual approaches to cryptography. And from what I understand, it'll be, you know, I'll be dead and buried before that's released. And what they do is they release material, particularly GCHQ, on a very protracted basis. So it's kind of like getting, you know, a certain amount of puzzle pieces in the box every year. So, you know, unfortunately, Harry Hinsley died right around 1996 or 97. It wasn't long after I met him where he passed away. So I don't know what he would have done now. I would have been absolutely fascinating to send this to him and the revelation of the doctrine and to get his input. And sadly, you know, because of my ignorance at the time, I never really had a chance to focus in on him, which is, you know, a great regret.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. And just as a last comment, because I know you have a tremendous amount of other material to get through. It would be fascinating to have a sense of who were the chair people of the Pinch Committee. Was he the only guy?
It was mostly from Bletchley. I mean, because Bletchley, the way he did it, Bletchley would say, okay, this is what we need, and this is where it could be found. And then they would give it off to Naval Intelligence, and Naval Intelligence then would turn it into actionable material. And then, of course, the delivery vehicle was Combined Operations. Because remember, Combined Operations is the only delivery vehicle that can do this. The British in 1941 and 42 are not on the offensive anywhere in the world. So as a result, the only way that they can physically come into contact with the material is to do it with raids. So that is something that also needs to be taken into consideration. And again, going back, if I have a gifted graduate student, you bet I'm having him or her taking a look at, you know, revising our understanding of combined operations based on the Pinch Doctrine, you know, without a doubt.
Thanks,
okay.
David.
All right, so maybe I should, unless there's...
No, let's go back to Michael just for a second.
Yeah.
Michael, sure.
I know I'm supposed to be ostensibly running this, but in the interest of being egalitarian, I'll raise my hand. Just piggybacking on what Alex was saying, Andrew McNaughton would almost certainly have had to know about it.
Yes.
There is, and again, this is disputable, but that he was not particularly fond of the operation or the Canadian involvement in the operation. If that's the case,
yeah,
did it have anything to do? How was it tied into knowing that if he knew that it was an attempted Enigma pinch? Well, what's your feeling about that?
Okay, well, my feeling is a lot of the reports of hesitancy and reluctance about this operation, again, ex post facto, distancing themselves from what is the biggest disaster up until this point. because there is nothing in the contemporary documents that supports that tone or attitude. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. There's a lot of crowing about this. I mean, like I said, Ham Roberts is, you know, they select Ham Roberts, and he is approved of for this operation by the British simply because he looks like a thruster, as they would say, a guy who is going to get the job done. In other words, he is not overly fancy, but he will crack the whip and drive it over the goal line if necessary. So, and that is a tone and a spirit that carries through all the way up the Canadian chain of command. And you can see it when they're talking about the special operation. Like, for instance, there's a message that's sent to Ottawa the night before the operation actually goes in August of 1942, which says the special matter I advised you of on July 7th is now underway. So, you know, there you can see that there's much anticipation for this, that they are looking forward to this. And the only time I ever see any kind of, you know, dismay or frustration expressed is after the fact. You know, there doesn't seem to be anything. I mean, the Canadians are going full bore with training. You know, it's not like they're stumbling into their training or taking it in a lackadaisical fashion. They're working hard. As a matter of fact, the Royal Marines are putting on, you know, training operations in Portsmouth Harbor, which basically is doubling as Dieppe. So they're able then to perfect, if you will, the infiltration and exfiltration. So it's full blown here. And again, that is one of, I would argue, the major revelation of the work I've done, I suppose, is not just the Enigma thing, to say the least, but really just how 1942, our understanding of the historiography of 1942 really needs to be revamped, which is fascinating. And just how much of it, again, has come after the fact. And if you actually go through, and, you know, maybe Gary has noticed this, maybe he hasn't, but when you start going through those files, going through the primary sources, they tend to paint a somewhat different vision or version than we have perhaps been led to believe all these years. And I guess it depends on, you know, what you're looking at, but certainly for Dieppe, that was the case. So Jim, I hope that kind of answered your question. I know it was kind of long-winded, but.
Okay.
Actually, that was my question, Gary.
Oh, sorry, Michael. Pardon me.
Don't worry. Just continue on so we can.
All right. So let me get back to this. Again, sharing screen. Thumbs up from somebody.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. Good. Okay. So here we go. This is actually one of the largest raiding forces when it comes to ships put on up until this time. As a matter of fact, as far as I know, it is the largest raid of the war. And it turns out to be, as Churchill originally called it, a butcher and bolt raid. Now, there was something that, again, I had to applaud Gary for in one of our conversations, which was the architecture of the Dieppe operation. This is not sledgehammer. This is not an invasion of Europe. There is no logistical tail. There is no way of setting up on shore. There is no provision to get on shore, build up, break out, and take the fight home. This is what it is. A cigar is sometimes just a cigar to a degree. It is a butcher and bolt raid. It's one day. We are going to sneak a raiding force, if you will, of 250 vessels, including 6 destroyers, 7 infantry assault ships, and of course a gunboat, across through a minefield in the middle of the channel at night. And we are going to hit the shores of Dieppe, 5 miles to each side, and Dieppe itself with thunderclap surprise right at dawn. And in the air above, there is going to be one hell of a air umbrella. It's going to have about 800 aircraft. Most of them are going to be fighters. There will be no heavy bombers, because heavy bombers, as was discussed, would actually take away from what they were trying to do, which was, of course, the heavy bombers, not very precise, would likely destroy everything thereafter, or more importantly, would rubble the streets to prevent the entry into the port and the pinch operation that was going to be carried out by the infantry, the Royal Marines, and the armor, believe it or not, the tanks. And I'll get to that in a second. So most of the covering air protection was of the fighter variety, and they were going to use fighter bombers or attack aircraft to come in right at a precise time, like a giant concerto. Everything had to be done at the right time. Okay, that's one of the big problems with the entire operation, was the fact that a lot of it was too intricate and it was based on timing. They had to come in and they had to hit the various German positions, the known German positions, to suppress the enemy, to allow the Canadians and the Royal Marines to basically be able to spring onto them, okay, to get onto them for sure. The land elements were the majority of the 2nd Canadian Division, Infantry Division, which had trained for amphibious operations. So they were not, complete neophytes in this. They were coming ashore. They had trained with this. So basically 2 brigades, 6 battalions, plus a few other elements. And of course, 60 Churchill tanks from the Calgary Tank Unit, half of which actually landed, Royal Canadian Engineers, eventually British Army commandos on each flank. Originally, they didn't have enough landing craft, so they were going to do it by airborne drop. But then they realized there were a couple of things with airborne drop that wasn't going to work. One, the weather. In other words, an amphibious operation could go in weather that an airborne operation couldn't. But most importantly, the element of surprise. Getting a bunch of troop-carrying aircraft over an area is just going to light up the Germans. So the last thing you want is that. So as a result, eventually, by the time it goes in, there's enough landing craft available where they can actually bring in 2 veteran pinch units from the Lofoten Islands to be able to carry out neutralizing operations on batteries on each flank. So these are the force allocations. And what's really important is not only the assault ships and the landing craft, but 6 vital destroyers. When you're dealing with the biggest crisis, U-boat crisis at this time, every destroyer is worth its weight in gold. And as a result, now 6 of them are here. And go back to what I said before, veto power. The Admiralty has veto power on this. They don't provide the vessels if they don't like the operation. And they only like the operation if there's something in it for them. And of course, breaking into the 4-rotor is without a doubt important, because not only has the 4-rotor been in operation with the U-boats in the Atlantic, but now, like a virus that's spreading, they can see it's coming in all over. Ships up in Norway have it. Ships in the Channel have it. U-boats in the Mediterranean now have it. And in July, the Tirpitz. They go over and start using the 4-rotor. Not all of them at the same time, but the Tirpitz does. So basically, you're getting a virus, a spreading virus, to put it into contemporary terms. And so as a result, this is important for the British Navy without a doubt. Okay. And you can see here German dispositions, and you can see one of the reasons why this operation has been cut down. Originally, it's planned as a 2-tide 16-hour operation, and then eventually it's cut down to a 1-tide, roughly 8-hour operation, is in part because of the tidal conditions. In other words, you're only going to get one chance at a 2-tide day. But more importantly, because there has been a general thickening of German reinforcements in the general area. Because, of course, as the spring turns into the summer of 1942, the Germans, of course, are, they are certainly up on the game that there are going to be raids. And so as a result, they are now positioning reserves close to various vital or potentially vital areas. So as you can see, the immediate area of Dieppe is not threatened, nor will it ever be. As a matter of fact, there was no reinforcements whatsoever carried on in the days leading up to it, like some historians have suggested, or suggested that this was done as betrayed as some sort of double cross game. There's no evidence to suggest that, but you do have, for instance, the 1st SS, and you have others within about a 10-hour march. So what they were doing was they decided they would cut it down to 1 tide so they could butcher and bolt before the reinforcements arrived. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, 250 vessels sneak across, and you can see here, this is where they were going to leave. They were going to leave from ports all over the southern part. Originally, for the first incarnation Operation Rudder, they picked 1 or 2 ports. The Germans figured it out through air reconnaissance, bombed the areas. And so they figured, well, wait a second here, we have to tighten up security. So tightening up security meant a couple of things. One, it meant leaving from a whole series of ports, not to, so not to draw attention to this, and also stripping down any vessels that were part of the raiding party that would not normally be operating in this area. So trawlers, destroyers, minesweepers, that was all normal. What wasn't normal were the barges. They were anti-aircraft barges called Eagle ships, which were part of the operation at first. They were stripped because as soon as they left the Thames estuary, where they'd been for 2 years, the Germans would light up. That's the same argument for not including anything larger than a destroyer. In other words, anytime you move a cruiser or a battleship into this area, it's going to draw German attention. The last thing you want to do when you're trying to achieve surprise is draw attention, and that would be one of them. So that was the reason. And they also figured they didn't need that kind of firepower. They had enough firepower for suppressive purposes as opposed to destructive purposes. So the idea was, all these ships are going to leave from these ports. They're going to rendezvous roughly around here, move through a minefield at night, and then spring onto Dieppe shores just as dawn is breaking on the 19th. And you can see here, it comes in 2 waves separated by a half an hour. So basically, the 2 flanking commando operations and the flanking Canadian landings are going to hit at roughly 0450. Okay, that's what they're planning, 0450. Why? Because they need to, hang on, guys. They need to take out the guns here and here, because there's no point in having a landing force sitting off here that is being shelled. All right, that is going to give away the game, and not to mention make your life a living hell if you're trying to transship and get men into shore. So the idea is they're going to hit here, they're going to hit here, here, and here simultaneously. Now, take out the guns on the east side, on each side, outer flanks, but on the inner flanks, these are also key. Because if you look at Dieppe, and if anybody's ever seen it, and in particular if you're coming from the sea, you will notice that the town is in the middle and it's flanked by 2 big cliffs. And this cliff will be able to rain fire down on the western part of the beach. But this cliff, known as Pollock Cliff, becomes extremely important. As a matter of fact, absolutely vital. Even to the point where the Royal Regiment of Canada, if their ships had been sunk on the way in or across, the whole operation would have been scrubbed. Because the idea was for them to get off the little little beach area called Puy, scamper up the cliff, move along the cliff, and take out the German guns at the top. This was going to happen in cooperation by the time they got there with the Essex Scottish that were coming in here and the Royal Marine Commandos that were coming right down the pipe here. So you can see that everything was kind of like the claws of a crab. And that's basically what they're doing. They're going to squeeze as much as they can, and then boom, they're going to come right down the middle a half an hour later. So the way it works in the port, and I think I have it here, and there's the map again. Hold on a second. I'm not sure if I have it here. Oh, I'll have to take a look at it. Well, we'll get back to, I'll show you the plan in a second. Let's just get back to force allocation. One of the big interesting parts with all this, almost half of the entire raiding force is dedicated to getting into this area of the port. Okay, half of it, particularly to the targets they want, the trawlers, naval headquarters, and the supply facility here. This is Pollock Cliff right here, which is extremely important. So in other words, the forces that are landing on Blue Beach are going to take it from the top. There's also going to be smoke. There's going to be direct fire from the ships offshore. And of course, there's also going to be support, believe it or not, from the Canadian infantry that are landing in this area. One company is going to line here and fire across to the German positions that are down below, which I'll show you in detail in a bit. Now, the force allocation just for this aspect 2 battle groups of Royal Marine Commandos, 350 Royal Marine Commandos dedicated to pulling off the Pinch in various contingencies. The first one is called Tiger Force. They have the X-Platoon is actually part of them. And so they have been used to operating for several months together. It's not like you're taking an adjunct unit and throwing it on. The 30th Assault Unit, which would eventually be 30th Assault Unit, the IAU, is carved out of 10 platoon. So they're integral. They already know how to operate with each other. You also have the 1 battalion, the Royal Marine Commando is broken down into 2 forces, Tiger Force, Roberts Force. Tiger Force going in on the Locust, the back of a river gunboat. And then the follow-up force is about another 200 men on the back of another gunboat called the Albatross, plus a bunch of Free French chasseurs. They're basically like patrol boats. And then, of course, you get 1 Canadian battalion, the Royal Regiment of Canada at Puy, another Canadian battalion called the Essex Scottish, who are going to land on Red Beach, 1 squadron of Canadian tanks that are going to take part in the Pinch, the bulk of the engineer combat teams, the entire floating reserve is there if necessary. So of the 5,000 men that hit, nearly half of them, 2,000 men, more than half of the tanks, and several dozen expendable naval vessels are all going to be thrown into Dieppe Harbor to get what they're after. So basically, had this actually worked, and it didn't, but had it worked, I don't think we'd ever be talking about Saint Nazaire in the same way that we do now as the greatest raid of all. So, as I mentioned to you, the outline plan, before the Canadians were even involved in this, if you take a look here, the first thing that we see here, sorry about that, hang on, this is not behaving properly. Right up here, you have HMS Locust with a detachment of Marines. So at that particular point, upon inception, the only unit that is actually part of this and named are the Royal Marines, which then works as the continuum through, right from the outline to the detailed planning stages in Operation Rudder, Operation Rudder 2, which is the pared down version, and then essentially what it goes in as Operation Jubilee, which essentially is Operation Rudder 2, just under a different code name. The Royal Marines are the running back. Okay, everything else has been built up. The Canadians have been built up like the offensive line to get the Royal Marines in and out. And it's right there, right from the start. Now, of course, we didn't know what they were up to. As a matter of fact, it was stated in the plans at first that basically they were there to capture and sink barges, which made absolutely no sense. As a matter of fact, historian Robin Nealons, who sadly passed away before I could speak to him, was a Royal Marine himself. His book is fantastic on Dieppe. When I was reading it, he was like and I've said this, he's like a blind dog in a meat house. He could smell it, he couldn't find it. He realized that the Royal Marines were the key, but he didn't understand why they were the key and what they were looking for. Sadly, he passed away before the declassifications came out. But I bet you he would have beaten me to this. There's no doubt about that because of what he was focusing in on about 10 years before me. So basically, as I mentioned, there are contingencies, branches and sequels, as the British call it, which are bound or wed into the DNA of the operations of the Royal Marines. There is nothing like this whatsoever in any other aspect of the Dieppe operation, whether it be air, sea, land, etc. Everything else essentially has been added on. This is the locomotive. So basically what you have is the cooperation of the Essex Scottish, the tanks, and the engineers who are storming Main Beach. Of course, after the Royal Regiment has captured the top of Pollock Cliff, they are in the process of the two of those, the Royal Regiment and the Essex Scottish, the tanks and the engineers, of creating a pipeline, the infiltration pipeline. The tanks are going to be used to burst into the harbor to be able to neutralize any of the trawlers and their crews that are still active in the harbor. Then you're going to get the Royal Marines that are going to barrel down into Dieppe on this ship right here, which is a river gunboat called the HMS Locust. And basically it packs a punch. It's got a couple of 4-inch guns. The Marines have retrofitted their mortars to the top deck. All the Marines are going to be lying on the deck with their Bren guns going, with their submachine guns, their rifles, etc. It's a pissed off porcupine, and they're going to run it down. Now, the interesting part is, once they reach what is called the harbor mole, that's their point of no return. If it looks like they're going to be sunk out into the channel, then they have to find a different way to get into the harbor. But if they can make the harbor mole and pass that point of no return, then they will go in with all guns blazing if necessary. Now, the fascinating part is, you'll see in a minute, there's a coordinating meeting to set all this up, which was unknown for years. You then get Robert's force of Royal Marine Commandos, and then, of course, Tiger Force following them in with orders to pick up the slack if for some reason Robert's force does not reach its target. Tiger Force is to do what Robert's force was supposed to do. So one contingency after another, after another. Then you also have the floating reserve, another Canadian battalion, the Fusilier Mont Royal, which can then be used when necessary, and another squadron of Calgary tanks, which can also be used if necessary to support this. So you can see right from the start, this is what this is all about. And there's a star power on this. The man who's leading this, who is the commander of the cutting out party, is the newly minted Victoria Cross recipient from St. Nazaire, Robert Edward Dudley Red Rider. Okay, he is the guy doing this. Now, you don't call out star power like that for a PR stunt. And you don't risk them, because as I was mentioning, the point of no return, and when they started to coordinate this, they would have to get down this, what is called the gauntlet. That's the harbor mole. This is the channel, main beach. And the locust is to literally barrel down. Once they get into this harbor mole, the point of no return, right down here, they're going to berth here. Commandos are going to hit, jump off here, and then hit all their targets, naval headquarters, all the trawlers, supply depot, and then there'll be an exfiltration plan to get them out, or at least the material out, not the commandos, but the material that they capture. So this is what is known as the gauntlet. And you can see, and these are amazing, some of these air photographs, you got to give credit to the aerial reconnaissance pilots who are doing this. That's an amazing shot right there. There's of course, the mole. That's Pollock Cliff, which controls the entrance to it. There's Main Beach. The Hotel Moderne would be over on the side over here at Naval Headquarters. All the trawlers are here. So you can see it's the simplest and most direct route to the targets is coming in over Main Beach. And here is an example of aerial reconnaissance at its best. Look at this photograph. Likely taken, I would argue, probably from a P-51, which were being eased into service at this time with the Royal Air Force as reconnaissance aircraft. But you can see the defenses on the harbor mole that Locust will have to deal with when they're coming in. And this is actually at the base of Pollock Cliff. And this is where the Germans have carved in a whole series of light gun and machine gun emplacements to fire and defilade at anyone daring to try to get down the channel into the port. So we are talking about something ripped out of the pages of a Hollywood movie here. I mean, this is boys' own, as the British like to say. There's no doubt about it. I mean, this would have been absolutely incredible, let alone harrowing, to be part of it. Now, as I mentioned, just before the original Operation Rudder was supposed to go in, there had been some problems when it came to getting everybody on the same page with the Pinch operation, partly because there was a bit of territorial arguments over who should be doing it. The Army wanted desperately to do the pinching, and they were pissed off that the Navy dared to do something ashore. So basically, there was a lot of squabbling going on, and eventually a meeting was called on the 28th that would hook up all the elements that were involved. So a meeting, and this was undiscovered for 70 years. Royal Marines, the Navy, the Essex Scottish, the Calgary tanks, and the Royal Canadian Engineers all came together to make sure that they had the pinch down. In other words, the operations in the port, which is absolutely amazing when you think about it. Now, the fascinating part was that the Locust was going to come in hell or high water. As long as it could make it to the mole, it was going to come in. And the orders were given very simply to look to the Essex Scottish. The Essex Scottish were either going to send a radio message. I think the code name was Trawlers. Brilliant. And if not, they were going to fire a flare. Green meant a cold reception. Red meant a hot reception. The significance being, no matter what happened, the Locust and the Royal Marines are going in. So in other words, even if all hell is breaking loose on the beach or in the port, the Royal Marines are going in with all guns blazing if necessary. Now, one of the first meetings, detailed planning meetings, Mountbatten shows up, which was very rare. And when he sat down, the first thing he discussed was what happens if Locust is sunk on the way in. In other words, in the harbor. And the decision was made to give orders to the commandos that if Locust was sunk on its way into the inner harbor, once it was in the channel, that the Royal Marines were to swim to their targets and obtain their objective. I mean, you know, this is Saint Nazaire on steroids, boys. I mean, this really is. This takes it to a completely different level. And so as a result, you can see that not only do we have the contingencies that are built in for this, but we also have the attitude that goes with this. In other words, this is the central feature of this entire operation. And so you can see here, I've just pulled out a few things of how it's all going to go down. And what I'm going to do is, I think I've got a map and these, oh, by the way, this is something else. We talked about operational orders. There's a big set of operational orders for the entire operation, but there were subsets of operational orders that were created but have never been found. This is the only one that I discovered in the entire journey, believe it or not. There should be other operational orders for all the other battalions. They are probably still classified. Can't find them though. I found this purely by chance in a miscellaneous file, an Admiralty miscellaneous file. And I happen to be flipping through it. And these are the actual operational orders for the Royal Marine Commandos. And they show what the Royal Marine Commandos are going to do, and particularly the importance of X platoon. By the way, any of the documents that I have here, I'll be happy to make available. A lot of them I've put out on my Facebook page or I've tweeted out and things like that. So you can just, you know, quickly do a search and find them. But by all means, feel free to reach out if you're interested in seeing more of these or whatever else, or, you know, you can see my interpretation of them in the book as well. So to give you an example, here's the visual example, which I kind of cobbled together. No CGI on this one, guys. I'm sorry. But you can see how this is all supposed to happen. Here is the port. Okay, there's the mole is up here, the inner channel, the targets, the objectives are down here. You've got the trawlers, you've got naval headquarters here. This is Pollock Cliff. The idea is by the time the main attack comes in over Red Beach or Main Beach, red and white, the Canadian infantry are supposed to be in position on top of the cliff. They have neutralized all the German guns on top. And of course, what happens is as they hit the main beach, the engineers will move into the city to remove roadblocks, which are in blocking entrance to the harbor in the tiny little streets of Dieppe. This is the reason why they didn't bomb. They didn't bring in heavy bombers and level it because the tanks would never get off the bloody beach if they did. So the idea was to come in with engineers and have the engineers and the infantry and the tanks cooperate with each other to get across the promenade, up the beach, across the promenade, into the city. The idea was that the engineers would then remove or blow at least one, if not as many as possible, of the roadblocks, which would allow the Churchill tanks and the infantry to then descend upon the Germans, again, like thunderclaps surprise, and be able to wield, relatively speaking, massive firepower with the tanks against the various trawlers and any enemy defenses in the harbor. Once that had happened, the signal would go up, and of course the Locust was coming in come hell or high water. What we also find out is that the Canadians are also involved with elements of the Pinch. They were told to get onto the trawlers, knock out the German crews, make sure they tie the hands of the prisoners to prevent destruction of their signals and coding documents, and of course, to search for naval code books. So the Canadians were definitely involved when it came to the Pinch. So that was part of their orders by getting on shore. So when that would happen, the Royal Marines would come down, both Robert's force and Tiger Force and Robert's force. They would disembark in the center island. They would hit their various targets with X platoon heading right for German naval headquarters, which based in the, if you take a look at the operational orders, the big ones, the Hotel Moderne is off limits to everyone. Nobody is allowed to go in without dealing with Huntington Whiteley first. So they are preventing looting without a doubt. They don't want anybody going in. This place is to be, if you will, hermetically sealed. X platoon goes in, does what they need to do. If there's any resistance, they have to take out the resistance. They have to grab whatever material they can. They have about, each man is carrying a haversack. They have fire extinguishers with them in case there's something that they have to work with or put out, I should say. Then they are going to scoop up anything they have, and then they're going to liaise with the Canadians. They are going to take what the Canadians have already grabbed, okay? Now, that's the infiltration. What's fascinating was there was also a code name for the exfiltration, and it was called Bullion. I do not make that up. It's like something out of Goldfinger. And by the way, I should tell you, and this is something I just discovered recently when I was reading Goldfinger, just having some fun, that Fleming mentions in Goldfinger, he was at a particular port where the Hotel Moderne and Les Arcades were side by side. So he's actually drawing on his Dieppe, as he did for a lot of his literary career. He would draw on things, and he probably had a little tongue-in-cheek fun with that one. But anyway, the idea was that there's also an exfiltration plan. So when Bullion is signaled, in comes a special R-boat that is put on specifically for this and has been trailing Locust right across the channel. It is supposed to come in, and Huntington Whiteley, or whoever's left of the intelligence commando, is supposed to put all the captured material on it right in the middle of battle, and it is supposed to be whisked out right back to the backup command ship, the HMS Fernie, where, believe it or not, Fleming is waiting for it. This is the only time that we see that Fleming actively takes part in any operation. He wasn't going to go ashore, but he was going to be the boy who was going to be the anchor man on the relay and cross the finish line first. And he had orders in his report to John Godfrey, which is then relayed immediately to Mountbatten. He mentions the fact that because the Pinch failed, in other words, they were slaughtered trying to get ashore, that the Pinch couldn't go down and he could not break off in the middle of battle and bring the captured material back as instructed. So that's, you can see the imperative right there that match up with the contingencies, etc. So once that was all done, then the engineers were going to lay on a massive demolition program within the port and just basically erase anything and everything. There was even a story that perhaps they were going to blow up a cache of torpedoes that apparently were somewhere buried in these cliffs for storage purposes. And if that's the case, then you would have had a mini Halifax explosion. All of Dieppe would have been wiped out, and you would have heard the bang in London for sure. It never came to fruition, and I guess you're lucky if you're a Dieppois that your city was not completely destroyed on that particular day. So that's actually, oh, by the way, that's a photo that's taken on the day from the German position. That's atop of Pollock Cliff. The Canadians sadly never got there. The Royal Regiment of Canada was massacred on Blue Beach and never really got off of it. So the Germans, and you can see the commanding position that they have from those heights. So again, it reinforces that boy's own nature, because coming along from the right to the left is exactly the route the Locust and both forces, Tiger and Robert Force, would have taken. Now, if the plan had gone according to the plan, where this photo was taken from would have been in hands of the Royal Regiment of Canada. The houses across the way would have been in the hands of the Essex Scottish, which means you have a firm shoulders of a pipeline that would allow the Locust in and the R boat to extract easily or relatively easily. So, of course, as we probably know, things did not go according to plan. And if you take a look at the casualties, and this is also telling, of 4,800 total casualties, 1,000 of them fatal, air, land, and sea. Vast majority Canadians. 916 were Canadians, but Americans were killed, and Brits obviously were killed, and Poles, etc. French, Belgian, Czech, up in the air. But if you take a look, the Royal Marines, the Royal Marine Commando take 100 casualties. Almost half of them are fatal. The 530 from the Essex Scottish, that's 94%. 94% from the Royal Regiment of Canada, 92% from the FMR, roughly. All the Churchill tanks that landed, all 29 of them were lost, and 188 Canadian engineers are lost. So basically, of the 4,884 total casualties in the raid, 2,039 are taken in direct pursuit of the Pinch, including over half of the fatalities. That's not coincidence. Not that the casualties are by design, but what they were trying to do definitely was. And sadly, they ended up paying the price. So that brings us back then to where we started, probably 2 hours ago, which was taking a look at the various excuses. And of course, I'll probably open this up now for a massive discussion, which should be a lot of fun. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff I probably haven't had a chance to touch on. If not, we'd be here until, 8 o'clock tonight. So basically, I figure I'll open it up, but please keep these in mind. Okay, keep these in mind as we sit back, take a look at the new evidence, take a look at the centrality of the new evidence, and then let's put each one of these, if you will, to the litmus test and see what we can do. Alex?
Okay, let me start it off. So were the tanks also basically expendable? And what were the plans in terms of getting them back out, the tanks?
Yeah. Well, if everything went according to plan, they were going to get in, they were going to get what they needed, and they were going to set up basically a cordon sanitaire, and then they were eventually just going to back themselves back on and get out. So that was the idea. But like I said, in these particular operations that are considered for A1 purposes, I mean, they could incur heavy casualties if necessary. So they knew that they were going to risk them. I don't think they expected that this was, no, I certainly know that they did not expect that this was going to be the disaster it was. Heavy casualties are one thing. Apocalyptical is something else. And that's essentially what you get here. You get apocalyptical levels, 94% casualties and things like that. Okay, so there was a plan to get the tanks off. Mm-hmm. Whether they'd have enough time or not is another question, right? Whether the conditions would be made. But basically, they were going to go back to the beach. And then they were going to, scurry on to the landing craft, and then they were going to be whisked away. Okay, Brandon?
Suppose I should know this already, but what was the German reaction when this is all over? Did they ever clock any intention of grabbing this stuff?
Yeah, well, the interesting part is, remember that the intelligence assault unit that Fleming came up with was actually based on a German unit. It was called MARES, M-A-R-E-S, and it's an acronym for Marineabteilung, and I forget what the other two or the other letters mean. But they had been in operation in France, in the Balkans, and in plain clothes in Russia, which is fascinating. So it reminds me very much of what special operations do today. And Fleming was fascinated. How he found out about them, I'm not sure, but there's quite a bit of information about them in the British archives. But he modeled the intelligence assault unit on them. Now, the fascinating part is when the Dieppe raid was over, Mares was called in to investigate. So the Germans kind of suspected that, probably incidentally, that there would be some snatching of material going on. And so they brought Mares in to investigate. And as far as we can see, I've never come across anything that suggests that the Germans twigged to what this actually was about. Or if for some reason they did, they didn't want to admit it. as far as we could see. But I've never seen anything, to be honest with you. I know Mares was there. I know they were worried. They were more worried about human intelligence as opposed to signals intelligence for some reason. They were focusing in on a printer, a French printer, because they were worried that he had somehow done their defense prints for the Germans and somehow had slipped that to the Allies, which could very well be true because, you know, Dieppe was a British playground for decades before this. So, you know, the British certainly had a lot of sympathetic ears in Dieppe. So I'm not really sure who Godfrey was tapping into for various intelligence for the workups. But definitely he had somebody on the ground because he made special inquiries all about naval headquarters actually being in the Hotel Moderne. And he was able to confirm it after a little while. So he had somebody there, or the British had somebody there who was sympathetic. But it seems that Mares wasn't there necessarily for SIGINT purposes, even though they did deal with it. They were coming in more in for the human perspective. Harry?
Hey, so yeah, the Germans did seem to be, from the German documents I've seen, they did seem to be pretty mystified as to what they were. I don't think they ever guessed what the real purpose of that was. So with respect to the tanks, which this is a question I have for you. I guess some of the tanks must have been going back and forth on that promenade for a couple of hours or so.
Yeah, that was the problem. See, and this gives you a good example of the sort of the amateur enthusiasts that Combined Operations Headquarters were. Even though they had built in certain branches and sequels, they arguably didn't center in on the ones that were absolutely vital, because what they had were infantry combat engineers. Okay, we're not talking about D-Day where you have special, you know, tanks or vehicles that are used, you know, for blasting fortifications. You have man-portable explosives, and they are bringing them over Main Beach. Now, they're being supported by infantry and they're being supported by tanks who are supposed to be working in conjunction. The idea being they're going to blow those roadblocks with the explosives. They're going to allow the tanks entry into the port. But the reality was that the engineers were gunned down. So in other words, as soon as they got off the landing craft,
never had
they
a
were some of
chance.
the first ones to go down, so they never had a chance. So what happened with the tanks was that the tanks got off the beach onto the promenade, but couldn't get into the port. So basically they spent the entire day running up and down the promenade, taking on the Germans as much as they could, but essentially they were corralled within that beach area, and they could not get out.
The point I was trying to make is in the German reports, they examined the tanks afterwards, the Churchill tanks, and they observed multiple hits from different calibers of anti-tank weapons all over them, but only 2 penetrations in whatever that was, 2 hours of time. So it just shows how ineffective their anti-tank weaponry was for their coastal units. Because you have a lot of time, obviously, to shoot, and it's not even clear that those tanks were even manned at the time that the penetrations they might have been able to get up closer to a, you know. But anyway, so that's one comment I wanted to make, and I just want to add, there's something else I see in the German documents, and that is these 26 large amphibious ships that they say are around the Isle of Wight. And so what is there anything, is that part of a deception operation? Is there anything that you see? Because obviously they're not, I mean, there's no way they could have 26 large landing ships there. They're just don't exist at that point in time. But they see that as proof that there's a follow-on operation if this first part succeeds. So that's been a big mystery to me. Is there anything you've seen about what these 26
no,
Phantom
not specifically.
ships?
No, not specifically. But I mean, look, part of it could be propaganda because they were throwing out the line that this was a failed second front, right? So for a failed second front, you need follow-up. But there was a deception operation. There was a deception operation at Boulogne. As a matter of fact, the bombers were going to be sent out to bomb Boulogne on the same night to light Boulogne up and get the German intelligence and everybody else to focus on Boulogne. They didn't think they'd be able to strategically or achieve strategic surprise, but they figured they'd be able to achieve tactical. So the idea was, you know, we can light up the Germans. We're just going to make them look in a different direction. Now, part of that I understand, was also a naval demonstration, although it's never been clear what the composition of that naval demonstration was. So that could very well be what you've tapped into, Gary. It may have been that they were offering up whatever these, I don't know whether that came through double cross sources or whatever else. I don't know where the Germans are getting that from. Was that from aerial reconnaissance, or was that from an agent?
It doesn't really say. It's just, but I see it in multiple different documents, including the after action report of the 302nd Infantry Division, German Infantry Division, which was defending their Dieppe, and they just make it a passing reference as if everybody, these 26 ships that we all know about. But I see it also in other documents elsewhere. So it's not just this one instance. So I just always wondered, where did they? But yeah, aerial reconnaissance. Well, there's no way there's 26 large infantry, left over, landing ships just, as part of even a deception that they could have actually had there. So I thought maybe this was part of another deception on top of deception, and maybe you'd run into that.
Yeah, it could very well be because of the source that it's coming from, right? In other words, you're saying if it's in those reports, because my first inclination would be suggest that it was propaganda. It was just a propaganda line they were throwing out there. But generally speaking, you wouldn't find that in their reports.
Right, not in the tactical units.
It would have to come through official channels, which means German intelligence.
I believe it actually came from Rudstedt's headquarters, that they disseminated this intelligence to the various units in France. But where they got it from, I don't know, and why they were pulled into this, I have no idea. Okay,
to be honest with you, I mean, I wouldn't be shocked. I mean, deception obviously is part of this game, especially when you need to achieve surprise, and surprise being as primordial to all this as it is when it comes to pinching. You definitely want to pull out all stops when it comes to surprise. I guess the question is whether it's tactical or strategic in nature.
Yeah, it seems to me it would work hand in glove with the cover for the pinch, right? You know what I'm saying? In other words, this is part of something bigger, and it's another layer of covering the pinch.
I know that Brian Villa has been working on trying to get the London controlling section files released. He thinks there's more there. I would probably agree with him. I just don't know how significant it will be. There's definitely will be more there. I know that from the research I did into the LCS files, there's no connection, as far as I can see, between Dieppe and Torch. Brian was arguing for a while, and I'm not sure if he still is, that basically Dieppe was put on to deflect from Torch. And there's no doubt that deception operations for Torch did occur, but they only started after Dieppe, or just a couple of days before, and Dieppe had absolutely Dieppe was planned long ago. Dieppe was planned in March. And this had nothing to do with it. Could it be convenient? Sure. But it had nothing to do with it being a driver for it. But look, I think that's a fascinating vein that you brought up. And yeah, I'll send you whatever I've got from the Germans, and let's see if we can, it's an interesting thing to find out where they actually got that information from.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Who's next, Brandon or Mike?
Michael's next.
Well,
Michael.
All right. It's actually a two-part question, or maybe a two-part question. First of all, and because I had talked to a couple of veterans of the raid, and the big caveat here is, but by the time I talked to them, they were in a nursing home in Winnipeg, so memory is not that reliable. But apparently they claimed, or they thought, they had gotten into a couple of buildings and onto a couple of ships or boats in the harbor. Yeah. So my question is, was anything, I mean, do we know if anything, any actual information, photograph, documents was gathered, even though they didn't get to the main naval headquarters?
All right, great question. Okay, as far as I know, and far as my research, there was nothing that was actually pinched on land or in the harbor, or at least nothing successfully extracted. There were anecdotal references, and I know what you're talking about, but also one of my Royal Marines that I spoke to, one of the Royal Marine commandos from X Platoon, well, he was the last survivor, when he was floating offshore after they tried to get into the harbor and then they were transshipped and sent in over landing, like in landing craft, and were slaughtered like everybody else. He was floating out at sea, and he remembers what he called a speedboat that came flying out of Dieppe Harbor and into the channel. And he remembers the guns up at Pollock Cliff, as he described it, bracketing the boat, and then finally on the third shot, hitting it, and it blew it sky high. So he had no clue. He wasn't sure whether maybe somebody had got in, grabbed some stuff, and was trying to get out, or maybe it was just somebody who was desperate and didn't want to fall into German hands who, you know, grabbed something, if indeed it happened. Now, like I said, as far as I can see, nothing in the research shows that anything happened on, you know, on land or in the harbor. But there was material pinched out at sea. One thing that I did not discuss, and we haven't discussed, and I put this down, is the so-called incidental contact with a German convoy that was on its way down from Boulogne to Dieppe was anything but incidental. The evidence is overwhelming to show that it was late. They were expecting this to be in Dieppe Harbor. And while they were crossing the minefield, they found out that the Germans were late. And now they were on a collision course with the left flank, which was something that they kind of expected could happen. So they ended up sending Locust out on a pinch operation out at sea. And so when the Germans arrived and slammed into the left flank of the landing, the Locust then got involved. And the interesting part was that the historical record of Locust was doctored to actually cover up this plan, or cover up this incident, that it actually took damage in a pinch attempt. And the reason I know this is because there is a report of the capture of one of the German convoy vessels and the material that was pinched from it. So somebody got aboard it and pinched material, albeit not of the golden variety, but they were able to get pinched material from one of the vessels. So indeed, the pinch operation did go down, or attempted to go down, out at sea, about 13 miles off the shore. And then, of course, they ended up following what was left, or attempting to follow what was left of that convoy in. But it gives you an idea of the centrality of what this is all about. In other words, that they were willing to risk everything by trying to pinch out at sea, which was absolutely fascinating. And the reason we know about this, and here's the American connection. The original members of the United States Armed Forces, which were supposed to take part in this operation, were not the United States Rangers, Army Rangers, but the United States Marine Corps. They were developing their raiding capability. And as a result, they had, he was a colonel at the time, he would become General Franklin Hart. Colonel Franklin Hart was part of the planning team for the pinch. He was working through the embassy and he was on Mountbatten's staff. And his report is the one that is available in the United States archives, not in the British archives or the Canadian archives. And he is the one that actually says that the Locust was the one that got wrapped up into this. And he mentions Locust by name. And the reason he would not be mistaken is because his Marines were supposed to go in on the back of Locust with the Royal Marine Commandos. But because of the success at Midway, because of operations in the Pacific, they were then taken off early and put on operations in the Pacific, and the Army Rangers were brought in and they were put on the flanks instead. But Franklin Hart's responsibility continued to track the pinch and what was going down on Locust. And that's what he did. And he is the sort of the lone voice on this. So I had to corroborate that. I had to go back and take a look at the various surviving elements of the ship logs, which is very difficult because combined operations for their reports have cherry-picked aspects of those logs. I've never seen the logs in total. So that's been difficult. but you can see the continuity in the time frame. And basically, they had chalked up the late arrival of locusts to the fact that it just couldn't keep up speed. It just didn't have the speed to cross the channel, which of course doesn't make any sense, because if that's the case, then you just start its journey 2 hours early. But what Franklin Hart mentions in his report was that locust takes damage during this pinch attempt with the trawlers in the middle of the channel, and takes some hits, and as a result its speed is reduced, and therefore it's late arriving off Dieppe. So the rest of the evidence actually corroborates Hart, which is fascinating, and it actually then reveals again what I talked about right at the beginning, that Combined Operations essentially has controlled very tightly the narrative of the Dieppe operation since it went in. And so as a result, through very limited sources, for cherry-picked evidence that they put together in their report, they have fostered a particular narrative which had for many times, or many years, completely cleansed the ultra-secret nature of what they were up to, which was standard operating procedure and fully in line. This wasn't just a question of Mountbatten and his boys covering their own asses. This was how you did it. You did not mention anything about ultra whatsoever in the standard war diaries. There was a separate war diary that was kept for ultra purposes, which brings up a whole different discussion when it comes to historiography and official historians and everything else. It's fascinating. So there you go. There's a very long-winded answer, I think.
No, I'll save the second question till after everybody else gets a chance. So.
Okay, who's up next?
Brandon.
Yeah, this is kind of follow on to what you were just talking about in a way, whether it's mythology or historiography. But the question is, I once participated in a Dieppe war game, and I was on the Allied side, and our secret goal was to capture a secret German radar station. We were on the right flank. We had to penetrate inland and grab this German components of this German radar. Where did that come from? Was that a post-raid disinformation thing, or?
No, that actually was part of it. That was part of it. That's what was referred to earlier. I think, was it Alex, you who referred to it?
No, that was me again.
Oh, sorry.
Don't worry about it.
That's okay. I did too many
Mike,
faces, too many arguments,
no
too many.
tonight.
Yeah. No, Jack Niesenthal was his name. He eventually shortened it to Niesen, or it was Niesen during the war, and then it was Niesenthal. He was a radar specialist that was attached to a unit from the South Saskatchewans. And basically, as they pushed inland, he was going to grab whatever was there. Now, of course, it was quite dramatic because, allegedly orders were given that he was not to fall into enemy hands, and basically his escort was to put a bullet in his head if he
right.
And he wrote about it. I think it's called Green Beach, if I'm not mistaken. He wrote about it. But again, like I said at the beginning, even though that's true, there are no contingencies whatsoever for that. If he happened to make it, wonderful. But again, he doesn't have half the raiding force getting him to. There's no, multiple contingencies. There's, there's nothing there to get him or anything else when it comes to the operation. Okay, so yes, without a doubt, and it would have been a lovely bonus. But not something that was considered to be absolutely central to the war effort at that moment in time. Not to that degree.
Actually, David, I can chime in on that. First of all, the book was Green Beach by James Lezer.
Yes, that's right.
It wasn't written by Jack Niesenthal, but he obviously was the main character. But what happened was they were supposed to get into the Freya radar system, and they weren't able to get in. But if he couldn't get in, he was to blow up the landlines, connecting the Freya system so that their communications would all go into the air, which he was able to do, and they gained very valuable information. The Allies pretty much gained everything they wanted to get from that.
Let me just jump in here quick. There was something else that actually was part of the Dieppe operation that was thrown on near the end. And that was real-time interception and intelligencing for the war effort. In other words, Bonsall, his name was I think it was Arthur Bonsall, if I'm not mistaken, but Bonsall was the last name. He was with Hut 3 at Bletchley. I think it was HUD 3, 6 or 3, one of the two. Anyway, he was offshore. And the idea was that because of the air activity, they figured they would have a target-rich environment for intercepting air communications or air messages. And sure enough, they did. And he was put in to see and to experiment with the ability of interception, decryption, turning it into intelligence and getting it back out for real-time purposes. And basically, he was swamped. In other words, it was, yeah, this could really work well, but the infrastructure wasn't there and we've been overwhelmed. In other words, it was more successful than we ever expected. But I have the document somewhere to show that that was done like just a day or two before the raid went in. So in other words, what they were doing, and a lot of times you can see this, there is a significant amount of mission creep. In other words, you start off with the pinch is what you want to do. You know you need to broaden it out. And so you do. And as you are padding it, then you're getting all these other units that are being invited to the party, whether it be SOE or whether it be, PWE, whether it's, one thing after another. So by the end, you do have a massive train that's heading towards Dieppe, and you got passengers of all sorts that are coming along for the ride. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go to Jim and then Frank and then... Not Michael. After that is Marc. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you again, David. Absolutely illuminating and fantastic to listen to this. And also, I wanted to give a shout out to your colleague, Mr. Woodage, who in his World War II TV, I mean, boy, we don't have 7 hours, but like you should maybe in your response just give a little plug to him because this was.
Oh, yeah.
Because what you did in that was quite amazing and people should definitely check that out. I have two questions. First of all, the question of how the Germans dealt with the issue of detecting and understanding possible invasion forces assembling or raiding forces to raid the continent, because, this is not like they're coming out like a regatta here. And, how were they responding, or what was their intelligence capability or understanding of raiding operations launched against the continent? And then secondly, you raised the intriguing question of that Marine general. And I know there's really no scholarly book or investigation about the Marine raider concept in World War II. But, because I see Gary in the chat refers to Carlson's Raiders, and unfortunately we have one of our former comrades was in Hotel 25. That was the rifle company that was the ready company up there near Hue that was sent in initially into Hue. And he was a mortarman, Michael Pio. So he would have loved this. But I'm just curious if you could flush out more the Marine side of it, because that's something I never heard of. But thank you.
No, that was the fascinating thing. I think that was one thing that really blew me away, because of course, Dieppe is the first time that American ground units are in battle in Europe on the ground. I mean, this is significant for the United States of America, and everybody sort of kind of fobs it off and says, well, it was just 50, Rangers who were going along for the ride. But that wasn't the case. When I spoke to Paul McGraw, who was one of the intelligence assault unit boys, they had trained with the United States Marines, because the United States Marines were supposed to be riding in with them to effect the pinch. And so that was absolutely fascinating. And they were led by a captain by the name of Roy Batterton Jr. So you can look that up. And I'm pretty sure he might have been with Carlson, if I'm not mistaken, but he certainly was with the Raider operations. And Jim, you're absolutely right. Again, another gifted grad student should be off working on Pinch Doctrine in the United States. I should also say that near the end of the war, the U.S. Navy produced a 103-page report on British pinch operations, because the Brits were selling this doctrine, attempting to sell this doctrine to the Americans. And that's why they were there. Part of it had to do with that relationship that I mentioned earlier, the intelligence sharing relationship. The Brits really didn't want the Americans going alone when it came to cryptography. They wanted to make sure that they held their upper hand. So when the Brits couldn't deliver the goods, they had to bring the Americans in on the fact that the four-rotor was a big issue, and of course bring them along to help them teach them how to pinch. The idea was you go off and do this against the Japanese. Now, I should tell you that there was one funny cultural caveat that I came across in that American report, which I thought was brilliant, which was, yeah, this is all fine and dandy when you're dealing with, as they put it, an Occidental people. In other words, where self-preservation is number one. The Germans will worry about dying, and therefore you might be able to get the material from them. The Japanese, on the other hand, not so much. So that was something that was fascinating that came out in the report. In other words, the idea of time and space and panicking and whatever else was something that fundamentally the Americans were challenging based on the fact that they would have to go into these operations against the Japanese and the Japanese mindset. So you can see the kind of level that the Americans were operating at, and the British were operating at that time when it came to pinch operations. But that's a fascinating report, by the way. It's about 103 pages, and it goes into, how sophisticated this was at Bletchley Park and naval intelligence and the planning and the maps that they had with all the targets everywhere in the world. And absolutely incredible. But it was done in late 1944, I think the report was done. To get to your other question about the intelligence. Now, the Germans were doing SIGINT. They were doing mostly direction finding. They were doing aerial reconnaissance. But from what I can see, I don't know specifically how successful they were when it came to picking up individual things and putting it all together. Largely, from my understanding, their defenses for raiding were based just on the logical understanding that this is what's going to happen, and also the various areas of terrain that could easily be raided, and also the tidal conditions. Because the Germans did not stand on guard all the time. They raised the alert when tidal conditions would allow raiding operations. And that was just standard operating procedure. So it's very difficult to find out that, for instance, like with Dieppe, they were already on alert, not full alert, but they were already on alert because the tidal period was, would allow raiding operations. So therefore, they went to a heightened state of alert, not full alert, but a heightened state. Were they absolutely ready for the raiding force? No, they weren't, because the convoy clash, even though they knew it was going on offshore, they just assumed it was one of many convoy clashes that happened all the time. So they didn't really raise an eyebrow to it until suddenly they were landing craft offshore and they could actually discern it. So when it comes to that, I don't know specifically. I mean, I've never come across anything, and maybe Gary has, or somebody else has, but I've never come across a specific package of material, kind of like what I've seen for the Allies. I'm not sure whether it didn't exist, whether it was destroyed during the war, or whether, somebody's still sitting on it. All I know is at the end of the war, the British, and particularly the Intelligence Assault Unit, who I've just been talking about, captured the entire German Kriegsmarine archive for World War I and World War II. Allegedly, Donitz had wanted it preserved to just demonstrate that he was not as much of a Nazi as perhaps he was going to be accused, and that the Navy kept their hands clean when it came to war crimes. So perhaps there was something that was captured in that is yet to be translated, or maybe it's sitting in an archive that we just haven't, focused in on. I don't know.
David, Gary has a comment on that. Let's pull him up on it.
Sure.
Oh, I was just nothing. I just put it in the chat. I validate what you're saying about the German coastal alerts being related to the tidal conditions. You'd see that quite often. Yeah. They would say, this section go on alert because the tidal conditions and weather conditions are favorable for invasion. So
yeah, it wasn't like they had a specific, set of intelligence coming in.
That doesn't mean that they've somehow detected something else, that they have other intelligence that's pointing. It's just those type of things.
Yeah.
Just for the historical record, I want to put in here that one of our colleagues in another endeavor we're involved with, Steve Jonas, had as a mentor in medical school a Canadian survivor of Dieppe.
Wow.
Yeah. Anyway.
Who was that? Do you know?
No, we can find out. We can find out.
Interesting.
Okay. Yeah, but I'm Jim. Just to say, I'm sure Gary and myself not Gary, David, I'm sorry, I'm getting you two guys mixed up. And possibly Gary. I mean, we've talked to Canadian veterans. I've talked to at least a few of them, if not several of them, from the Dieppe Raid. And the problem there, again, is how much they knew and how good their memory was at the time. So you have to take that into account.
Oh,
Yeah, and of course,
this guy's long deceased. This guy's long deceased. But anyway, I throw that in there.
No, but just remember that when and I've been asked that question a couple of times, remember that, you know, for security purposes, everything is stovepiped. So in other words, it's need to know. And, you know, basically, if you're with the Essex Scottish, hey, get on that trawler. Your objective is a trawler. Get on there, you know, knock out the crew, make sure they don't destroy their signals documents, and grab the code book. Don't ask why, just do it. And that is standard procedure. So it was the same thing. Everything was compartmentalized. So, you know, it would only be years now. And imagine the stuff that was going on in Vietnam. Imagine the stuff that's been going on in Afghanistan. You know, we probably won't be able to piece it together for 30, 40, 50 years, or at least whoever comes after us anyway. Okay. But that would be, you know, again, that's the nature of history. And that's part of the beauty of it, you know, is coming to terms with things like this and seeing, you know, finally seeing the documents and being able to put all the puzzle pieces together. It's, you know, it's a wonderful journey without a doubt.
Okay.
Who's next, Frank?
Frank and then Marc.
Okay, this is wonderfully revelatory. Superb job, really. And
thank you.
What you've shown is that what previously understood as nonsensical in many ways. It's you know, a frontal assault onto something that was of no value, it seemed, and you know, narrow roads going to what exactly? Why do this? Well, you've revealed all, and this is excellent. But it should have succeeded. That's the problem.
Yeah. Well,
There's
to be
no
honest
way-
with you, like we're doing with Gary and Sledgehammer, wouldn't it be fun to do this as well?
Yeah, but I mean, from intuitively, this should have succeeded. It makes no sense that it didn't. And that's the problem. Because from the German discussion we've had here, they were exceedingly alert. And, you know, I know there are comments from the Canadians that they were waiting for us. But the Germans themselves don't know why they were alert. There really is, they don't know why this mission went on. That's according to your research. They don't know why this happened. You know, there's a picture of Sepp Dietrich, who's, you know, one of the more clueless of the Germans. He's just looking at these Churchill tanks, and why this happened, they don't know. So that's where you start the questioning. Why did this fail when it should have succeeded? And the answer may be as to who did know. Unfortunately, quite a few people knew about this at Bletchley. Quite a few people knew about this possibly on the 16th of August. Now, this thing went off on the 19th.
They did, yeah.
And those people weren't German. Blunt knew about it. Philby knew about it. Guy Burgess knew about it. And Stalin knew about it probably on the 16th because Churchill told him.
Yeah.
Churchill was in Moscow under extreme pressure, trying to explain the torch as a substitute for the sledgehammer and the Second Front. He was being so was Allenbrook, by the way. All of them were being constantly pressured as to what is going on. What are you doing right now? And there's the famous discussion that took place on the morning of the 16th when they're all sort of drunk. And Stalin walks out for 2 hours. It's quite possible that Churchill said, look, I think Burse, who was the interpreter, may have said in his his own memoirs that it was mentioned that there was going to be a raid of some kind. And, you know, if you look at the posture of the Germans at this time, it's amazing. Your map there. So you've got the 1st and 2nd SS, I think the 10th Panzer up there, or one of the Panzer divisions, plus the 7th Parachute Division. It's amazing. It's an amazing array of force that the Germans don't know what they're looking at. I mean, they're there, but they don't really know why they're there, because based on what their reconnaissance is showing, this is a small force, but they're arrayed in such a way that they're ready to take on 6 divisions landing the Continental Peninsula, which is the max that could have happened. Yep. They're there for something huge. And the fact that the RAF was shot out of the sky makes no sense either. I mean, I cannot understand how, you know, Rundstedt was spot on. He put them into an alert status. For what? Because the tides had changed? Doesn't work with me. There's something wrong with this picture, and when it finally is revealed, that'll be interesting.
Okay, well, let me jump in there, because I'm not sure exactly what evidence you're pointing to, because one of the things, of course, has been that the Germans knew. And I have never been able to find anything. As a matter of fact, there was nothing moved up into the Dieppe area. There was no reinforcement, no new aircraft, no new artillery, no new infantry that showed up. So there wasn't anything in that direct area. Now, not to say that they weren't tipped off that something could be brewing somewhere, which would be a pretty good deception operation to put on, coupled with the fact that you're reinforcing whatever their preconceived notions may be. So that could very much, Frank, be what you're kind of tapping into. But also, I think, to get back to what our earlier discussion was and another topic, maybe they've already twigged into Sledgehammer and the other one that's been bandied about for a while, Imperator. Operation Imperator, which is, if you think Dieppe or Saint Nazaire were tough, try landing a force and pushing on to Paris. They were going to land somewhere in Calais. They were going to push on to Paris. They were going to raid Paris and then try to escape through Dieppe, which was absolutely fascinating. And it was going to be done over a period of days, if not a week or something. And it was just an absolute suicide mission. But this was something that they were going to keep in mind as the cri de coeur, just in case that the Russians were, you know, crying and they needed something. But to get back again, Frank, to what you were saying, indeed, Churchill, who knew fully about this operation and all the essential features of it, which is fascinating, he does mention it briefly to Stalin, sort of as a farewell gesture. In other words, oh yeah, by the way, keep your eyes out, something's happening. But, you know, the fact that this was conceived of in March and April, there's no direct connection to the fact that Dieppe was put on. He certainly offered this as a little bit of, yeah, I know I've disappointed you, buddy, but, you know, this is happening. And the fascinating part is, as soon as he gets on that plane and flies back to, I think it was Egypt where he flew to, he gets in touch with Pug Ismay, who is his boy on the liaison with the chief of staff. And he asks, what is the status with Operation Rudder? In other words, he's still using the original code name. And then, and it's in the book, I have it in the book. And Ismay gets back to him and he said, Rudder, which is now called Jubilee, is the same in all essential features. And it will go in on the night of the 18th or the 19th if there's bad weather. And his next signal is, it's the 18th or the 19th or whatever it is, and Jubilee has begun. So there's no doubt that Churchill knew. So in other words, you know, Brian Villa's original thesis of this being unauthorized is out the window, but I would argue that that perhaps reinforces his later interpretation of it being unorthodox. And certainly it was. And my argument is, because of the ultra secret nature of it, that falls perfectly in line with the rules of the game at that time. In other words, everything to do with ultra is kept off the books. And particularly if you're adding to this the concept of the double bluff, where, you know, for reasons of security, everything has to be limited to the utmost. Even naval intelligence was caught flat-footed, allegedly, except for Godfrey. Godfrey knew exactly what was going on. One of his staff approached him and he said, "What the hell is this Operation Jubilee?" And he said, "Oh, no, don't worry, it's rudder." Oh, like they didn't even know. So there was an extreme amount of secrecy. Again, that reinforces the idea of surprise, right? We do this. But it certainly shows that Churchill knew. Churchill knew on his way to Moscow that this was going to go down. He also, apparently, according to what Ismay says, understands all the essential features of the operation. Okay? So he knows the nature, whatever that has been expressed to him. And remember that Churchill, like I said at the beginning, is a man of intelligence. He is, you know, during the First World War, when he was First Lord, he was the one who took the captured German naval code books from the Russians. You know, he's been wed to signals intelligence. He understands the power of signals intelligence. This is a man who sits around at night in his pajamas with his brandy and his cigars and goes through his box of Ultra that shows up every day. You know, so he understands this. This is part of what his thirst is for. So yeah, without a doubt. I mean, there are certain things there, but again, and this is what I was kind of happy about during our discussions over Sledgehammer, was understanding that the architecture is completely different. And one thing I noticed was that Dieppe, right from its start, whether it be Rudder, Rudder 2, or Jubilee, moves in its own lane on its own plane. It's never mentioned in connection with anything else, with the exception of one little mention that maybe this might be a good idea before we pull off something like Sledgehammer, but that was done as an aside after the plan was done. So, and there's nothing in the planning documents, unlike there are in Sledgehammer and Imperator and Wet Bob and whatever else, that say specifically, this is about attempting to draw the Germans out for an air battle. This is about attempting to draw the Germans, back to the east and support the Russians, or the west and support the Russians. Nothing like that with Dieppe. Dieppe, everything is innocuous. Everything is just, vague. We're just kind of there. Which is fascinating. In other words, for whatever reason, they couldn't come up with a proper cover plan other than just being vague about this, and that again falls in line with the instructions from the Cabinet Office when it comes to covering up anything that has Ultra at its core. So
let me just say that obviously I'm implying that there is a third hand involved, and that hand is Soviet, and why they are doing this, it's just total conjecture. But they're the only ones in this that could have done something to upset this through their own connections. And they have their own intelligence network, and it may have been for their own benefit. And certainly when I mention those names like Blunt, Burgess, and Philby, they knew about it. And so did Stalin. And Stalin verified that this thing was on. And he knew on the 16th that this thing was on. And that is disturbing in itself, in that, I'm postulating obviously something that will be considered completely ridiculous by most. But I cannot, from my point of view, as, reading a lot of military history, see why this failed. I cannot see it at all, other than the fact, and when you reiterate that the Germans themselves had no idea, even after studying what took place, what the purpose was. They don't know why.
Yeah,
that makes no sense to me. Because,
well, let me see if I can try to give you something to chew on for a bit. What I mentioned before was the Pinch Doctrine. When you take a look at the Pinch Doctrine, you realize again what I was saying before, that the slider for surprise is not put in what I would argue the normal range. It's put on 11. Okay, not 1 to 10.
Absolutely.
It's 11, and they've gone to that degree, and so as a result, everything else kind of suffers. So and also too, the accusations of Mountbatten's planning staff being amateur enthusiasts, I think is correct. I mean, it really is correct. I mean, there is a hubris that has built up since the earlier pinch raids. In other words, they all succeeded. We didn't have any problems. We had very little casualties. What could possibly go wrong now? And you can see that, and I'm not conjecturing, you can actually see that attitude. As a matter of fact, the original naval commander, Bailey Groman, basically is squawking, saying, look, there's no joint appreciation done here. Everybody's working in silos. Like, hey, get our act together here, boys, or we're going to get our asses handed to us. And what happens? He's relieved. So there is this drift that is happening. In other words, it's confirmation bias. This is going to happen, and it's going to happen the way we want to, because this is what we're selling. These are our wares. This is what we're putting on display for both the Americans and whatever else. So they are operating in this amateurish way. They're not, combined operations is not accepting proper criticism, all right, or strength, stress testing. They're refusing to do it. I mean, everything is going to work. In other words, we know what we're going to get, and we're going to do it, and this is the way we're going to do it. But if you take a look at the plan, Frank, and this is, I think, maybe what we should do after we finish Sledgehammer, is maybe take a look at this and see if, hey, maybe we could have planned this properly. What I argued before, if Pollock Cliff is so instrumental, why didn't they have proper contingencies in for that as well, etc.? You know what I mean? There was a lot of moving parts going on, but there was nobody there to really come in and oversee it. There were no lifeguards at the pool. And that's the real problem, I think, and why they had their breakfast handed to them. It wasn't like the Germans were on alert. The Germans were... Okay,
then I'm wrong from the assessment. I'm looking at what you've shown.
Frank, we have to move on. We have to move on.
Okay, I thought this was an excellent operation.
Look, it's fascinating, and look, we need to continue this eventually. But also, I'm very interested in what you brought up about the Soviets. I'm fascinated to find out what that evidence is about Stalin knowing about this in advance. And that's fascinating.
Okay, let's move on to Mark, and then I think.
Yep.
And then Alex has another question, and Michael.
David, again, thanks very much, David. This was very kind.
My pleasure. My pleasure. This has been so much fun to be able to speak to, a group like you guys. It's awesome.
So thank you. My question is, one of the that Mountbatten liked to say afterwards, and when he was ever interviewed, was it was worth getting these Canadians killed because we learned so much and that we applied it in D-Day.
Yeah.
And of course, anytime you have combat, both sides learn things.
Exactly.
And of course, the Germans, I know they learned some things, but I'm curious if you could illustrate, what did the Germans learn? And the impossible question, who learned more significant things? Who came out of the battle having,
Okay, great question. I'm not sure that either side learned anything fundamental out of this. Okay, there were a few little things that they did pick up upon. But to get back to you, the broad concept, it's kind of like Ken today. Ken, did we do this so you could learn how to Zoom? No, we did this to talk about Dieppe, but Ken is going to pick up stuff about how to handle this as we go along, right? So of course, you're going to learn lessons in everything. It reminds me of Cliff Clavin on Jeopardy, right? People who've never been in my kitchen. That is what, Mountbatten's excuse has always resonated with me and with everybody. In other words, and even Godfrey himself said, look, you didn't need Dieppe to learn lessons of amphibious operations. We were doing this in staff school. We did it in World War I. We did it at Madagascar 3 months before Dieppe. We know how to pull off amphibious operations. Of course, you're going to learn things, and you're going to attempt to learn things about various aspects. One of them, I would argue, is pinching. I mean, they were there in part not only to succeed, but also to learn and to improve their doctrine. There were other things, like I said, handling air intelligence in real time. That was something that they tacked on to learn. There were certain things about coordination. One of the big successes of Dieppe, of course, was the ability to coordinate 250 ships and sneak them across the channel. That's absolutely fantastic in the middle of the night and actually affect surprise. That was something that was amazing. Where the Germans, I don't think the Germans learned that much out of this, except for the captured operational documents that they did find. they were able to glean some information about how, how basically how micromanaged everything was, where basically you had a 200-page script that needed to be followed. The Germans really, for the most part, kind of fobbed everything off and just said, these guys are essentially amateurs. I don't know if there's anything that I can think of that they really found. I mean, they mined as much as they could out of the tanks that they captured. The one thing that I will give the Allies success for on this about lessons learned was learning to create armored vehicles for engineer duties. Because my God, think of the disaster on D-Day if you would have had your engineers running across an open beach like you had at Dieppe. But again, none of that was in the intent of the operation. That was something that came out in the wash after. I can't think of anything fundamental unless there is something above that we have yet to see, like in Deception. Maybe there was a game of foxes going on up at the Deception level that has yet to make it to the public domain. But I tried to go down every rabbit hole, as you could see, of everything. And I followed Tate. Tate was the big double cross agent at that time. As a matter of fact, it was Hugh Henry, who's, by the way, Hugh Henry's done fantastic work on Dieppe before me. Hugh was going down, he was studying with Harry Hinsley, and he was going down the road towards Tate. And then it just didn't pan out as far as I could see, mostly because I think there were some classified documents that he kind of ran into and couldn't get declassed. But from what I can see over the last 25 years, nothing along those lines from a double cross network has popped up as anything kind of credible.
I thought that the Germans had realized or appreciated more the importance of pillboxes, and that they built up a lot more pillboxes.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a good thing. Because really,
it's good for them.
Well, maybe it was good at Dieppe, because remember, you have a relatively small force of Germans that are inflicting massive amount of casualties, largely because their tactical planning for defense is phenomenal. Not to mention you're on home turf. Your boys have trained and drilled until ad nauseum. They have been skillful in bringing their artillery coordinates down to 2 as opposed to 6 on a map. In other words, they just have to, everything is pre-registered. So it's very easy to call in and be flexible with your firepower. So basically what the Germans are doing is maximizing firepower over manpower. And, war is on a budget and they're stretching it and getting the most out of it for sure. So yes, you can argue, I suppose, that part of their understanding was to start putting up more pillboxes, which again, how much of that translates then into a Maginot mentality? In other words, yeah, we can build up a wall, but if we don't have a ceiling, they can drop in behind us, or there's firepower enough to blast through us. As you can see with D-Day. And also too, it goes back to the old maxim, was it Frederick the Great, he who defends everything defends nothing?
Yeah.
So, really what they needed were mobile units, and they were building those up as well, So I'm not sure necessarily whether it was that or whether that was just kind of a knee-jerk reaction as opposed to something that was really well thought out,
All right,
Interesting though, interesting. So.
Your choice, Michael or Alex?
Oh, let's go with Michael.
All right, but I'll have to come on again at the end to wrap it up and to give you a chance to talk about what's coming up in the future. But here's my question for now. We all know, we all try to find some way to find some silver lining to the loss of Canadian lives at Dieppe, considering that we know that the Canadians killed at Dieppe numbered more than total Canadian casualties at Juno Beach on June 6th.
Yeah.
So, and of course, for a gain of a lot less. The Canadians did amazingly well on D-Day and 4 days afterwards. But here's one thing, and it's totally inadvertent, and I'd like to broach this idea. The Canadians excuse me, the intelligence, whether or not the intelligence was gathered is how much intelligence was gathered, but certainly from the German end, they seem to have deduced that there was no security breach, that they had lost nothing as far as intelligence gathering, as far as the Enigma machine and the code books, etc. Would that have given, or did that give, considering that the four-rotor system was broken into by other means later on, subsequently, did that give the Germans a false sense of security as to the what the British did or didn't know about the Enigma, about the four-rotor system? Did it actually make the Germans basically give them, in essence, a false sense
I see where you're going.
System? Yeah.
Okay, it's a very good question. It's a very complex answer, simply because a lot of it, I think, has to do cultural and institutional when it comes to the Germans and their general approach to signal security and potential penetration. The Germans always suspected that Enigma could be penetrated temporarily. Okay, that's one of the reasons why they changed the code books on a monthly basis. They figured that it was a temporary penetration, and that would be it. What they would not admit to, I'm not sure if they could understand the conception, was the very factory of intelligence that Bletchley Park was. The fact that there was a consistent and sustained decryption effort that was going on, and it was milking them like crazy. Even if they came to that conclusion, there was too much riding on it, as I mentioned earlier, when it came to pride, prestige, and fear of being shipped to the Eastern Front, to actually admit that you dropped the ball to that level. Now, bringing in the four-rotor was already on the books because it was developed before the war and it was already being distributed in 1941. That was before any of the penetration occurred. Now, some of the things I hear is, and I had to look into this. Oh my God, if the Germans figure out that you've grabbed an Enigma machine, a four-rotor, or the code books, they're simply going to bring in another. No, it doesn't work like that. One thing that the Germans, first of all, outfitting every single vessel and headquarters, you're talking 4,000 machines. First of all, the outlay for completely changing your encryption system is insane. Not to mention just getting it done overnight, getting the distribution, making sure that everybody is on the right network is very, very difficult. So what the Germans tended to opt for were kind of little tweaks to the system. Okay, so in other words, don't bother changing the car. Let's just get a new horn. Let's get a new, carburetor. Let's get a new fuel injection system. Let's just make it, amp it up a little bit. And this is what they were doing during the war. But they didn't realize that by this time, because of the successful pinch operations, which allowed the kind of penetration on a consistent basis, coupled with the intellectual prowess of the cryptographers, or cryptanalysts, I should say, cryptanalysts, pardon me, that they would be able to do this on a regular basis, that they that all their little tweaks never amounted to much, because Bletchley would be able to figure it out very quickly and figure out some remedy. What they needed was a fundamental change of system. So in other words, asymmetrical encryption or whatever else, they needed to change the entire methodology, their approach, and they were nowhere near doing that. And again, like I mentioned earlier, I mean, one of the reasons why I give Churchill so much credit was because even some people would argue he was or he wasn't an intellectual, depending on what you're looking at least he understood and embraced it. He may not have necessarily understood the process, but boy, did he understand the product. And that was the key. He embraced product. The Germans did not. The German cryptographers were very good. They broke Naval Cipher 3. They did a lot of damage, but there wasn't the kind of reception committee at the upper levels of the German armed forces, the way and political circles, as there was with the Allies. And to be honest with you, that including the economy and a whole bunch of other things like the atomic bomb, is probably one of the big reasons why the Allies were able to survive and then win the Second World War, because of that kind of intellectual acceptance and reception for things like this, which is something that we don't see in the anti-intellectual world of Nazi Germany. So, maybe that's, again, a kind of long-winded response to that.
That's an excellent response. Thank you, Gary. I'll come on after the last question.
Okay, so let's go to Alex and Brandon, and just we're coming to an end. We've been here a long time.
Yeah. I'm giving David a long time for an excellent talk. So I'm going to challenge channel a good friend of all of our, many of ours, Carl, and ask a movie-related question to this, which is, since you said, I think it was 96 when you came across the original Pinch Doctrine.
95. Yeah, 95. Yeah.
So when U-57 came out, you must have just put your head in your heads that here we have a movie finally about what I've been researching, and it's the worst movie you could think of on the subject.
Well, John Bon Jovi aside, I really enjoyed it. I mean, it was a lark. It was fun. It was interesting, and whatever else. Wasn't history, but then again, I was going to a movie, right? So yeah. But like I was mentioning in the chat before, before we started this, when I broke the story years ago in 2012, I guess it was 10 years ago now, I got approached by Christopher Nolan's people. And, that's when he was considering whether to do Dunkirk or whatever else. And, Dieppe was thrown on, and eventually it didn't work out. He took Dunkirk. But my God, how amazing would this story have been with $100 million budget done in IMAX and 3D and everything. And that's how they were selling it to me. And needless to say, they didn't have to do much of a pitch. As soon as they said that, it was like this story. Wow. Okay.
And actually, anyway, maybe you could have, with Dieppe, maybe you could have done it with a few hundred extras.
Well, to be honest,
Dunkirk, you just can't get Dunkirk with the small, without CGI, really.
No, exactly. But also, too, you think about the international aspects of this, and you think about Canadian and American and British, and then even with Frank was brought up, even a Russian backdrop to this can easily be brought in. So I mean, if there's anybody out there with a few $100 million in your pocket who want to do a movie, please get in touch with me.
Yeah,
I've got some great ideas, guys. Mr. Hanks, Mr. Spielberg, if you're out there. But yeah, it would be fascinating because it really is. And had it worked, think about the impact. Breaking the four-rotor 6 months before. Fundamentally being inside of what was going on 4 to 6 months before it actually happened. That could be a lifetime in war, without a doubt. Think of all the ships that would have been saved. Think about the kind of confidence the Allies would have had moving forward. How that would have affected 1943, I don't know, whether it would have sped up the process in any way. But, at the end of the war, I mean, Harry Hinsley had said in one of his things that, having something like Ultra, all right, the ability to read German and Japanese codes, shaved 2 years off the war. Now, I suspect he kind of pulled that out of his butt. But the concept is there. In other words, that yes, without a doubt, when you have inside trader information, oh boy, are you going to be very judicious in the decisions you make. You're going to take calculated rather than blind risks. And that's certainly something that we see. And it's just a much more cost-efficient way, in theory, of running a war, So, it definitely would have had a positive effect. How much, I don't know. But it to get back to what Hamilton Robert said, what we're after could mean a huge thing in the course of the war. I don't think he was wrong.
Okay, we're going to go to Michael to decide if he wants to go for more questions or not. Okay, Mike, you got it. Unmute.
How many other questions? Do we have
see
any other questions?
Brandon and Frank with their hands up, but I'm not sure if those are just lingering or whether
I think Theo might want to have a question.
Well, why don't, because all I'm going to do is wrap it up and give David a chance to do his plugs. So if we have any other questions, if you want to take them, David.
Oh yeah, no, by all means, let's go.
All right, so,
Brandon.
Go ahead, Brandon.
Well, I've already gone twice, so why don't I let Mark has only had one shot, so he can go first at least.
Okay, Mark, and then Frank and Theo. Are you looking to make a comment or a question? No. Okay. Go ahead, Frank, and then Mark, and then Brandon.
Was it Frank or Mark? No.
Frank.
Mark. Oh, I don't know. Anybody.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I'm sorry. Mark, and then Frank, and then Brandon.
Okay, very good. Okay. I'm curious, after Dieppe, did the nature or the frequency of raids and or pinches change? And if so, why?
Yeah, they came to a dead stop as far as I could see, although they were proposing further ones. They were looking now more towards the Mediterranean, but because the Allies went on the offensive, particularly in Sicily and then Italy, they could then tack on any of the pinch requirements onto the operations that were already going. Also, too, once they got into the four-rotor in late fall, early winter of 1942, the imperative kind of dropped a level, if you will. So as far as I could see, there weren't any others of sizable pinch raids that went in, or at least pinch raids of that form. They may have been able to drop back to some of the smaller ones, but I haven't been able to see anything along those lines. It looks like Dieppe, they pushed the envelope too far with Dieppe. That's my gut feeling on this. And that's one of the reasons why you don't see them like this afterwards. That and the fact that the imperative nature of breaking into the four-rotor had already been taken care of by other means.
Thank you.
Frank?
Okay.
Who is next?
Yeah,
Okay.
Frank, you're up.
I'm not going to harp on what I was talking about so much. The somewhat like Michael's question. From the German perspective, the outcome benefited who? Because OKW, OKH, if you read the accounts from Valemont, this was a propaganda coup for those, particularly Hitler, who were justifying keeping so much force in Europe, to face a hypothetical invasion.
Mm-hmm.
And this was obviously, as we pointed out in the last Sledgehammer discussions, it's detracting a lot from their efforts in Blau and Brunswick and taking up Stalingrad and the Caucasus. So would you agree that this worked in favor of those Germans who were advocating keeping force in Europe, Western Europe, as opposed?
Yeah, it certainly didn't take away from their argument. I mean, something like that, it certainly didn't take away from their argument. I don't know how much they actually parlayed this, but, I mean, this is something that they'd been building up for a while.
You realize that Zeitzler, who was in charge, took over from Halder as OKH head. So this was a big coup for those on that side of the fence who were saying that definitely there was going to be an invasion, even though nobody over here seriously was taking it into consideration. The Brits particularly.
Okay, but then again, to sort of look at it from a different perspective, it may be kind of along the lines of the tidal conditions. In other words, take a look at the political conditions, right? The upswing that you have in the Second Front now. And of course, everything that I've seen suggests that the Germans were fully, or they believed completely that the Western Allies would, without a doubt, be forced to give in to the calls from the Soviets for a second front. So, I mean, part of it could just be that logical conclusion as opposed to anything specific that came along. This certainly, of course, would have reinforced that for sure, and that's
yeah, but
that's what the Germans were, that's what the Germans were trying to float.
No, wait, that's the Germans. There's plenty of Germans who are disagreeing with Hitler at this particular point as far as taking force away from the East to the West, particularly Das Reich and all these divisions. So that's not quite true that they're doing that. okay, there's going to be a huge switch in power to Hitler at this particular point coming up to September. And yeah, what happened here alters that.
See, the problem is I mean, I would caution, because remember, this is a pinprick. I mean, and this is something that, of course, even Churchill was saying, when they were putting in various operations and discussions over Sledgehammer, discussions over Imperator, those operations were built to land and stay for at least a temporary period. A butcher and bolt raid for one day is likely not going to get anybody's temperature to rise, period. But it does kind of fill into that overall narrative the Germans have already convinced themselves of, that the Russian demand is going to require either raiding operations or it's going to require a second front. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not really sure, what angle you're trying to get at here.
I'm saying that there are two viewpoints.
Yeah.
And the viewpoints, that logically, from any tactician or strategist point of view, it doesn't make sense for an invasion to take place in Western Europe from what the assets are available to the Brits.
Okay.
And yet they're putting massive force into Western Europe. And so therefore, what happened makes sense.
Now, I don't know this for sure. I'm just throwing this out there, but go back to what I said at the beginning of this talk. The idea about, like a historian, an intelligence analyst has to look at what the reality is as opposed to what should the reality be. So in this case, Frank, maybe what you're saying is correct from the theoretical perspective. In other words, or maybe from the evidentiary perspective, there's no evidence. So maybe it's one of those things where they're screwing up. In other words, that, the evidence may be telling us something, but our logic tells us this, and therefore we're going to go with that. And then maybe what you're seeing is a flip of that afterwards. But I just don't know if Dieppe is that. I don't know how instrumental Dieppe is to swinging that from what you're saying. I'll be honest with you. I've never really looked into it from that perspective when it comes to the political fallout within the German military, when it comes to certain schools of thought and approaches. I've never really, thought of that. I just, in the German mind, Dieppe just, was kind of a blip. So I'm not sure how much of an impact that would have. I mean, if there's evidence out there, by all means, show me. I'd be fascinated to see, if this was instrumental in changing, the German mindset over this, or even provoking.
Parliament certainly says.
Yeah, he does. He says that.
Yeah, he says that they're those are gloating over the propaganda of this. That this is a huge success when. From their argument, it's not just a blip; it's a huge military success. So that's all.
Yeah, or they just making it a huge military success because it's the only thing they've got going right now on the Western Front. Not to say that things are going bad, but it's just been a golden egg that's been dropped into their lap. I mean, let's face it, regardless of the intent, it's still a massive disaster for the Allies. Right. So are they just taking, advantage of that opportunity? Or is it something that was scripted? I'll be honest with you, Frank, I really don't know. That's interesting. It would require more investigation for sure. Okay, but I'd like to see that.
Let's go on to Brandon and then Mike. Go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, this is a nit, so it's fine if you want to minimize the answer. I was struck in your discussion of the plan of going in and taking out the secret information on the boat over down this narrow waterway, right? Yeah. And on the cliffs, how these dug-in machine guns and so forth, which I think some of the recon might have known was there. Yep. But then exactly what happened with the entrance, I mean, let alone the egress, and then why did the British then go forward and torch? And I know there's very little connection between the operations, but what went on at Casablanca, where they kind of, the whole thing, I guess like Saint Nazaire, they tried to come in and coup de main, I guess, with guys on boats that weren't even armored or anything. What happened there in that process? Do you have any idea?
I'll be honest, I don't. But I mean, at this particular point, I'm not sure. I mean, again, I think it just kind of reinforces the different nature of them. I mean, torch is an invasion. You know, you're there to deliver an army that's going to stay, that's going to build up, that's going to break out. Whereas here, you just have a very quick boy's own butcher and bolt, get in, get what you're after, and get the hell out. So I have a feeling that the answer to that probably lies in the difference in the architecture between the operations. I just don't think there is as far as I can see, I can't see a direct connection between them. I just don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. Unless it was a question of the imperative, which at that particular point had already been solved, but I don't know. But again, you're tacking on to a larger operation, whereas this is the engine in this one. That could be the reason for it. Interesting.
Okay, well, thanks. I personally have to interject here. Incredible presentation. Totally absorbing.
Oh, thanks. It's the audience. This is so much fun with you guys. I've been enjoying it tremendously. And, you know, to have this level of knowledge and interest is just, it's been a treat for me, to be honest. I mean, how often do I get a chance to sit for 3.5 hours and talk about what I work on? This is just fun. It's fun. So thank you guys. Thank you for hanging in.
Okay, don't go away, please.
All right.
Michael is going to conclude this
Gonna
event,
wrap it
and
up.
then we have a closing word from Jim. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, well, actually, I was just going to give you my closing word here, which is that, first of all, I wanted to say one little comment. And by the way, if you'll notice, I actually went back on camera out of respect for you, also because it turns out I have enough juice to do it. But to me, it's amazing. You brought up a lot of things. One of the things we didn't discuss, and I didn't want to lead into it, was the fact that when you were talking about thunderclap, surprise, all these phrases that were then again used with Operation Market Garden.
Yeah, there's a big whiff of Market Garden in this.
Yeah,
this is a reach too far. Yeah.
Yes, but it's amazing that that they actually didn't learn that lesson from Dieppe when it came to Market Garden. But
I mean, that's easy to get swept up in a lot of things like that. I mean, I've been in a couple of corporate board meetings, you know?
Yeah. And especially since we were winning in 44. So hubris is much easier to glom onto. But I just wanted to say that I thought, you know, your presentation, I wanted to thank you for a brilliant presentation. And I wanted to thank you also for reducing the workload I had to do in introducing it. You really have it under control. You're a one-man army. You're the Tommy Prince of Zoom. And I wanted to give you a chance also to tell us what you're doing. In other words, tell us about the book. Tell us about what's coming up. You're doing now.
Okay. Well, I do have, like I said, the second edition of this is out in hardcover right around the world right now. And I do have the paperback version, which is coming out for the 80th anniversary. I will be over in Dieppe for that. So if anybody is over there, I'm going to be doing a battlefield tour, mostly with the Royal Regiment of Canada. Fantastic organization that they've put together. Jane Poulton Turvey's dad landed there, and he has passed on since. He survived, but he's passed on. So she put this incredible program together where she's been tracking down the names and the photos and the stories of every single man from her dad's regiment who died. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant what she's been doing. So I'll be joining her there. I was supposed to be on a bunch of battlefield tours this summer, but because of the lingering pandemic and the fact that there's a war, we've pushed those off until 2023. So I will be in Normandy and Western Europe in 2023 doing battlefield tours in the summer. Got, like I said, the second edition of this. I'm working on my third book, which has nothing to do with the Navy and nothing to do with the Army, unlike the first two. It has everything to do with a Canadian and British bomber crew and some incredible things that happen with these guys. So I'm working on that, and that'll be out sometime in 23 or 24, depending on declassifications of material. And I'm just busy teaching at Marianopolis College, where I've been for years, and get a chance to enjoy this every once in a while on Zoom. So there you go. How's that?
That's great. And just provide us with ways to get in touch with you if you want.
Yes, you can reach out to me anytime I have a personal Facebook. I have a Professional Historians Facebook. I'm active on Twitter. It's @O'Keefe Historian on Twitter, and just my name when it comes to my Facebook pages. And by all means, you can track me down and email me at the college. I'm at Marianopolis College in Montreal. So there you go, if anybody wants to reach out.
I don't see you at Dieppe, but for the Dieppe 80th, I'll see you at Normandy for the D-Day 80. And I'll turn it over to Jim right now.
All right. Well, David, thanks a lot. You know, I knew this was going to be as terrific as it has turned out to be. And thank you so much for spending time with us today and sharing the vast wealth of new insights you have about this operation. It was just quite illuminating. And once again, the World War II TV thing that Paul Woodage did, it's just as equally mind-blowing. 7 hours, but well worth it.
Yeah,
And
if you get a chance, go to YouTube, WW2TV, and look up the Dieppe. There's 3 parts that we did, which is, you know, again, Paul's been fantastic with that.
all right. And I want to thank Ken Aaron in Los Angeles for patiently sitting there and doing his thing with the engineering and the live streaming onto YouTube. We would not be able to do this with the level of technical proficiency that we're able to attain without your help, Kenny. So everybody should give Ken a great applause on that one.
Yep.
Thanks.
Now, coming up on the 23rd will be Professor Robert Paxton, who is 90 years old. I don't think we're going to get him for 3 hours, but we'll see. And he will be talking about the whole question of how Vichy France reacted to the idea of a landing in 1942, and sort of be very interesting. And Gary will be quite controversial because he actually says in conversation with him that he felt the Vichy French would have fought with the Germans in 1942. So that's going to be interesting to hear. I've also put into the chat, we're negotiating to have a contemporary topic to be dealt with pretty soon. So Ken, we're going to have to tap on your skillion soon. But this is a discussion of a new book that has just come out by Columbia University Press on the Azov Regiment in the Ukraine. And this is an author, Michael Colburn, who is the lead investigator on Eastern Europe for Bellingcat, which we've talked about before. One of the great open source operations going on, and that is going to come up, and be aware of that. And finally, we're going to have Paul Kennedy at some point in May, and we're going to be talking to him about his new book, Victory at Sea. And so that should be quite interesting. I have a feeling we'll get a different kind of response to that. And anyway, once again, everybody give David a great hand, because it was a really true tour de force that he did today.